Good morning, everyone. Can I invite everybody to take their seats? Boy, you get quiet, very quiet here in Delaware. Way better than Washington. Well, welcome, and welcome to what I know is going to be a marvelous day of networking and learning and conversation. My name's Liz Schreier, and I am the President and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, and we are absolutely thrilled to have our first event here in Delaware, and given the energy already I saw out in the hall, this is not going to be our last. There is something very magical about getting a group of powerhouse thinkers and doers together who really care about making a difference in the world. And today we have gathered here business leaders from all over the tri-state region to faculty and staff from 13 colleges and universities, state and local elected officials, members of the diaspora community, and leaders from faith organizations and nonprofits, all gathered together to tackle our topic today, America's role in the world and how leading globally matters locally. And I'm so thrilled to thank our partners, both locally, they're all listed on your program, as well as our national global impact partners who made today's event possible. But there is no one who made today's event possible more than our host and the inspiration for this event than your senator, my friend, and the rock star on the Washington scene as well as the national scene, and that's, of course, Senator Chris Coons. Now, Senator, it's really nice to see you in person. Usually I see you when I'm brushing my teeth, either early in the morning or late at night, because you're on my television and all the time, but you are on television really shaping the day's news, interpreting the day's events, and literally from day one of you. Thank goodness for all of us that one of your passions and your skills is that of the international affairs scene. We were so honored several years ago to pay tribute to you at our annual tribute dinner for your leadership in development and diplomacy. It was an extraordinary privilege for us. We are going to be talking about these very issues today. And when you, over the last 5 years, have hosted this marvelous event of an Africa Summit, but you called me several years ago and said, would you partner with us to take this platform to a new level? It was a privilege for us to say yes, and today we're going to do an experiment to try to take a half a day and together to really look at this topic that we talked about. But what's interesting for all of you who are new to the USGLC is that this is something that we do actually around the country. Delaware is not alone in this conversation. We were once called by the Washington Post the Strange Bedfellow Coalition. Now, we got that name because we bring an unusual group together, not dissimilar to the group I rattled off that is here today. We represent over 500 businesses and NGOs, everything from DuPont to Microsoft to Pfizer to Save the Children and World Vision. We are bipartisan. We have a national advisory committee that's chaired by Colin Powell that includes every former living Secretary of State from Henry Kissinger all the way through. We live in every single state, from Maine to Texas, all throughout the heartland. And we are so proud, and you're going to hear from one of them today, General Kip Ward, that we have almost 200 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals. And what brings us all together is this belief that America needs to be a leader in the world, and that leadership needs to include our development and diplomacy alongside defense in order to keep our nation safe, in order to, in terms to advance our economic interests, and of course, our values throughout the world. And what do we do with that? We do two things. We advocate and we educate. We advocate for the international affairs budget. That's a little 1% of our federal budget. A lot of people call it the foreign aid budget, though it's so much more. It is our Peace Corps, it's our State Department, it's our healthcare workers in West Africa that fought against Ebola spreading. It's the programs around the world that help create America's jobs and for our goods and services. And it is also the work that we do to educate. Conversations like today that make sure that people understand the ROI for investments of our civilian tools. And I'll share with you this one story. I had to make sure that I explain that it's not just the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do. I had to testify in front of the Senate not too long ago, and you just have a couple minutes to do this in. So I shared 3 numbers, and this is what our conversation is going to be about today. First number, 30 million. 30 million, of course, is the number of people that are suffering from a horrific famine throughout the world. And of course, it's in places like Yemen, Nigeria, Somalia, and South Sudan. But it's also a national security risk because all 4 of those countries harbor terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, ISIS. Second number, 65 million. Of course, that's the number of people who are being displaced throughout the world, the largest number since World War II, most of whom are women and children. Of course, once again, a horrible humanitarian crisis, but also a national security risk once again, because it destabilizes our allies like Jordan. And the last number I shared was 320 million. And that's the number of Americans that are at risk for the next Ebola. And whether or not the question is before us of whether or not we are investing in healthcare systems around the world, because we all know that there could be another infectious disease that can hit our shores. So none of us, these are some of the issues that we're going to discuss today of how leading globally matters locally. None of us are naive about the challenges that are in front of us, but what we do know is that we have a great story to tell. And so what I want to share with you to close is this. A lot of people know that Washington is perceived as not working so well. And lately, you kind of feel it when we live in Washington. Senator Coons knows that. Congresswoman, you probably feel that as well. But what I can tell you is that there is one issue that really covers bipartisan support. And that's the issue that joins us here together today. I saw it when there was an effort to cut large amounts of budget cuts on the international affairs budget, and from the Freedom Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, there was unanimous voice saying, nope, we're not going to do it. And last Congress, when there was very few bills that were about to get passed, there were 8 bipartisan bills on just the issue of global development that got passed. And if you don't believe me, take a look at these folks.
Some say Washington is broken.
That our country is just hopelessly divided.
But let's be honest, people like to exaggerate.
No.
Yes.
The truth is, there's a lot that still brings us together.
Both Republicans and Democrats.
Democrats and Republicans.
A consistent bipartisan effort
To help lift people out of poverty around the world.
In the last 2 years, Congress passed significant pieces of legislation that strengthened American global leadership,
Advance our economic interest.
Make us more secure.
and champion our values.
How about the Water for the World Act?
It promotes safe, clean drinking water for 1 billion people around the world.
Not bad.
Or the Girls Count Act.
That's going to ensure that girls around the world are protected
from trafficking and exploitation,
allowing them to get the education they deserve.
And that can be game-changing.
Together, we crafted and passed the Electrify Africa Act.
This bill is a step toward fulfilling America's promise to reach 50 million people in Africa and create
30,000 megawatts of generation capacity.
Now that's powerful.
That's huge.
The Global Food Security Act is a big one.
We are tackling the root causes of hunger through America's Feed the Future initiative.
And already lifting millions of farmers out of poverty.
And providing millions of children nutritional support.
We joined together to pass the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act.
That bill ensures an even greater return on investment for the American taxpayer.
It's a big win for this small
but strategic 1% of the budget.
I voted for that.
I voted for that.
I voted for that. I voted for that too.
And so did every one of my colleagues.
every
Single
one.
We even got a little wild.
No, not that kind of wild.
We got the End Wildlife Trafficking Act into the end zone.
That's END, Eliminate, Neutralize, and Disrupt Wildlife Trafficking.
That law helps cut off billions of dollars.
Billions of dollars to the terrorist organizations from the illegal wildlife trade.
And we just voted for the End Modern Slavery Initiative Act.
A powerful step towards ending sex and labor enslavement for good.
That moves more than 27 million people
In 165 countries.
Closer to freedom.
Yeah, I'd say broken is perhaps a bit overstated.
We're getting things done for the American people and for the world.
Clean water.
rights for women and girls,
Energy infrastructure.
Food security.
Preventing wildlife trafficking.
Thwarting terrorists.
Ending modern slavery.
It all adds up.
It all serves to make our nation safer.
and stronger.
I'm not saying we don't disagree on a few things.
But at the end of the day,
We're working together for our country.
To build a better, safer, and more prosperous world.
And that is something we can all be proud of.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the host for today's event, an inspiration for today's event, and somebody who truly brings and is respected by both sides of the aisle, a champion of America's global leadership, Senator Chris Coons.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you to the USGLC for that remarkable brief video that highlights what we've actually gotten done in Congress. I hope you'll like that, share it, click on it, or connect to it on social media, because I showed it to my wife this morning. And I'll tell you, she said, that's really all good news. Why don't more people know about that? And I said, that's part of the point of this conference. It's for us to engage in a real conversation, both about what we're getting done on a bipartisan basis in Congress and about our place in the world and the challenges that we all face. So I am grateful to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition for what they've done to pull together this conference, and for all of you for investing your time and your passion in a morning dedicated to discussing America's role in the world, why leading globally matters locally. Well, why does it matter locally? In the years that we've had an annual Opportunity Africa conference here, we've highlighted the ways in which Delaware businesses benefit from global trade. Companies well known and long established like AstraZeneca or DuPont, Mount Air, Purdue, GE, and other small and startup exporters. We've highlighted why it matters to our faith community, to the African diaspora community, to folks who are enriched by service and by partnerships between the United States and the continent of Africa. But frankly, as my role in the Senate on both the Foreign Relations Committee and the Appropriations Committee has grown, and the challenges we face around the world have grown as well, I thought it was time for us to strengthen and broaden this annual conference. I am so grateful to Christy Gleason, who has carried much of the challenge and the work of making Opportunity Africa thrive over the last 5 years. Could you give her a round of applause, please? And I am thrilled to have a great team working with Christy, with me in Washington. I know Tom Mancinelli is here and a dozen other folks who work on my staff in Washington. We've got more distance to go. You saw some of the 8 bills that we got signed into law by our last president. We've got several more I'm hopeful will get signed into law by this president. On Tuesday, the Foreign Relations Committee is marking up a multilateral financial aid review bill. Soon thereafter, I hope to introduce a development financing bill. We've got the REACH Act with Susan Collins that focuses on maternal and child health around the world. And once again, Bob Corker and I, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, are going to take a run at food aid. So we've got a full menu this year. As some of you know, my history with Africa begins in 1984 when I was a young college student and went and spent a semester in Nairobi, living all over the country and being exposed to and changed by the powerful hospitality of the Kenyan people. I went back in 1987 and went to Tanzania, to Uganda, to Kenya, and to South Africa. I wrote a book about my experiences. I was active as an advocate in the anti-apartheid movement. But then I moved on to do other things here in the United States around housing and education and in the private sector manufacturing. It was almost literally a generation later that I was elected to the Senate by you and had the chance unexpectedly to chair the Africa subcommittee and return to the continent I had loved as a young man. And that window, that difference from the mid-1980s to the early part of this century, to 2010, 2011, 2012, was striking. And I just wanted to make this point at the outset, if I might. There are far too many Americans who say that the money we invest in aid and development is wasted and that the people to whom we give it and with whom we work don't appreciate it. Nothing could be farther from the truth. In my 7 years serving you on the Foreign Relations Committee, I have been struck by just how much our work in partnership with the nations of Africa has transformed the country of Kenya and dozens of others. And I don't think you know how much credit the American people deserve for transforming a continent in partnership with the peoples of Africa. Our Feed the Future program, launched by President Obama, has prevented 500 million people from being in famine today, even as we are in the midst of one of the world's greatest humanitarian crises. President Bush's initiative, the Presidential Malaria Initiative, has saved 7 million lives that would otherwise have been lost to malaria. And PEPFAR, one of the most transformational investments in public health in human history, has literally saved 11 million lives to date. Give yourselves a round of applause for being the sort of people who support that sort of investment. So why is this a question? Well, a little over a year ago, the American people elected Donald Trump as 45th President of the United States. And he came into office with a pledge to reshape American foreign policy and, as he put it, to make America great again by putting America first. And in the last year, I have seen our leadership role in the world debated more than ever in my life, both at home and abroad. For the past 70 years since the end of the Second World War, the United States has in many ways been the architect, the country that advanced a global liberal rules-based order that helped provide for prosperity, for security, for the American people, and opportunity for democracy and capitalism to grow around the world. And at this very moment, that role, that historic leadership role by the United States, is being questioned. As a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I meet with our allies and our adversaries. I get to meet with private sector and government leaders from all over the world. And in nearly every conversation I've been in, whether here in the United States or at global conferences abroad, there is deep and persistent questioning about the path the United States plans to take under this administration. They want to know if we will still honor our alliances, if we still prioritize long-standing American values like human rights and the importance of the rule of law and support for democracy and multilateral leadership. They want to know if we'll continue to help lead the response to humanitarian crises like famine, to terrorism, and to global climate change. They want to know if the partisanship that seems to divide Washington over absolutely everything will take hold in our foreign policy as well, dividing the long-standing bipartisan support for our strategy for advancing America's security, diplomacy, and development on equal footing. From the beginning of the transition, the Trump administration talked of building border walls and deeply cutting funding to the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development, and cutting or eliminating our food aid programs around the world. They followed that talk with decisive action, proposing a budget that cut funding for state and AID by 30%, by refusing to nominate people for key posts in the State Department and leaving career diplomats out of the decision-making process. The good news is that so far in the Senate, on the Appropriations and Foreign Relations Committee, Republicans and Democrats, many of the partners you saw in that video, have worked closely together to push back on these proposals, to restore full funding for most of our global programs, and to sustain our leadership in the world. But there's a lot more work to be done, and that's why we've assembled today. We have a remarkable array of speakers from public service and the private sector, folks who have experience that will allow them to answer your questions and to speak consistently to what I believe to be the best bipartisan path for our country forward. We'll offer an alternative. one that values diplomacy and development just as much as the effective, credible deterrent offered by our military might. As my predecessor and friend, Vice President Joe Biden, has often said, we need to lead by the power of our example more than we rely on the example of our power. We are proud on this Veterans Day weekend of the service and sacrifice of our military. We recognize the necessity of force when all other options fail, but we should be proud as well of those Americans who serve as diplomats, negotiating political solutions to enduring challenges, as aid experts, promoting innovations in health or agriculture, as commercial attachés, advocating for U.S. companies for export opportunities, and as nonprofit leaders and volunteers showing our values in response to human need. We believe that investments in our Department of State are wise because diplomacy is cost-effective and the preferred method of addressing real challenges and developing opportunities around the world. Investments in USAID are important because they address human needs and generate proven returns on investment. The professionals in USAID work around the world to deliver global health services, ensure access to food, and provide emergency services in time of crisis. They support refugees, promote democracy and rule of law, and advance human rights. And despite what you hear in the media, when it comes to answering the question of how America should lead in the world, there is indeed broad bipartisan agreement in the Congress, and I believe here in Delaware as well as beyond. So today, thank you for investing this time. Take the time to ask pointed questions. I appreciate your engagement and your investment of time. Know that we will have a remarkable array of speakers worthy of your time from both parties. President Trump's USAID administrator and a former Republican congressman will be joined here today with President Obama's Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. We're here because leading globally matters locally. You reflect that truth. You know the world is larger than just us here in the United States, and we have to be concerned about the plight of refugees, especially children, in Nigeria, South Sudan, Syria, and other countries. So your voice and your engagement is more important than ever. Get to know each other during networking breaks. Visit the tables in the foyer and learn about programs and organizations that might connect with your interests. Engage in the sessions and press us to keep up this engagement in the months to come. We've got a remarkable array of speakers today from the private sector and public sector that Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester will be facilitating in a moment. The first panel includes former Congressman Dan Glickman and Secretary of Agriculture, Curtis Etherly from Coca-Cola, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, Assistant Secretary for African Affairs under the Obama administration, and Lieutenant General Kip Ward, First Commander of AFRICOM. And our second panel will be facilitated by Dr. Patrice Johnson-Gilliam of the Delaware Department of Labor and Jason Gross of USGLC to talk about how we lead in a complex and ever-changing world. Joining them are Nancy Lindborg, who spent a decade running Mercy Corps and now leads the U.S. Institute of Peace. Imagine that. Rachel Glenister, Executive Director of the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, someone who is an incisive economist with leading thoughts about how to be transparent and accountable in foreign aid, and Carolyn Roan, who leads corporate responsibility for Pfizer. And finally, former Republican Governor Mark Schweiker of Pennsylvania will set the stage for my concluding conversation with USAID Administrator Mark Green and USGLC President Liz Schreier. We have a full day ahead of us. Thank you for being here early. There's still time to encourage friends to join us here at this full crowd. And I would appreciate your posting social media about your thoughts and comments and engaging actively with us. I want to take one last minute and introduce the other elected officials who've joined us today briefly. If you all would just stand, I'm just going to say your names really quickly and then introduce Lisa. We've got State Representative Brian Short, Newcastle County Council President Karen Hartley-Nagel, Newcastle County Councilwoman Lisa Diller, Newcastle County Councilman Penrose Hollins. We've got Rashima Dixon from the Wilmington City Council, Chris Hamilton from Newark City Council, Kathy McGinnis from the Rehoboth Beach Council, Rob Stout from the Middletown Council, Valerie Larey from the Newcastle City Council, and from the state of Maryland, Jacqueline Gregory from the Cecil County Council, and Jacob Day, Mayor of Salisbury, Maryland. Could we give a round of applause for the elected officials who've joined us here as well? I am so excited about the day ahead, and I am so thrilled to have as our opening facilitator my friend and colleague, someone who endures that ride back and forth to Washington with me nearly every day, Someone who has more energy and more optimism than I do. She must, because she serves not in the Senate but in the House, where Delaware only gets to send one and where she strives mightily against those who would divide us. Lisa Blunt Rochester made history in our last election as the first statewide elected woman of color to go to Congress representing Delaware. She long served us as Secretary of Labor and as the State Personnel Director, and is someone I have known for decades and whose heart I deeply admire and with whom I had a magical opportunity to travel to West Africa last August. Ladies and gentlemen, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester.
Good morning. Good morning. And first, I want to thank the USGLC for your leadership and for your example of how we can all be. I know from the fact that you have so many opportunities for us to learn as members, but also this gathering today, I think, represents it very well. I also want to thank my good friend and colleague, Senator Chris Coons, not only for his warm introduction, but for his friendship and for his mentorship. This guy is an incredible person. I mean, we do see him on television all the time, and we see him out and about, but he has a very deep heart and a very sharp brain. And he is, you know, they say the hand, the heart, and the head. He's got it all. And so I wanna really acknowledge Chris. You know, as a congresswoman, I got an opportunity to go on my first CODEL, which some of you know are those trips that allow us as members to, on a bipartisan way, get to see issues and dig deeper and understand the world, but also even understand each other. And Senator Coons actually gave me the privilege of allowing us to go on a CODEL together to West Africa in August. It was an amazing trip. It was insightful. It was personal for me as well. And it was demanding. This man, we did 4 countries in 1 week. We went to Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and the Gambia. And while there, during this trip, we had the opportunity to meet government officials, NGOs on the ground, and other organizations regarding issues related to security, counterterrorism, political and economic issues facing the region of West Africa. We met families, displaced families. We met the Chibok girls who have been we've been trying to rescue for over 3 years now. We actually went to the area where Boko Haram and ISIS are. It was chilling. It was chilling to ride in these, you know, basically armored vehicles and then get out and talk to people. We did all of these things. And I will tell you, I've lived, I've worked, I've visited over 25 countries in my life. My son was born in France. I lived in Shanghai, China for 4.5 years. I'm an international relations major. But nothing prepared me for that trip, to see firsthand on the ground how U.S. global leadership makes a difference, how vitally important it is for us to support the international affairs budget. Since the Cold War, we all know that the United States has been looked to around the world as a leader. We project power not only through our military, but through our diplomacy and development programs out of the State Department. I was fortunate to go to Jordan for 3 months through a USAID-funded project to work on poverty alleviation. That was because of that budget. A strong State Department is just as important as a strong military. They go hand in hand. Even Defense Secretary Mattis said it best when he stated, quote, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately," end quote. Our diplomats and aid workers deserve our thanks and support as well. They work all over the world, and as was said, often in very difficult conditions with very little recognition. As we know, the foreign aid budget makes up only 1% of the federal budget, but it has far greater reach and makes a significant impact on those we help. So greater investment is needed so that we can continue to project this soft power around the world and continue to be a leader. If we don't make these smart investments now, other emerging powers will fill the vacuum. It is now my honor to introduce the first panel, Africa Rising. This panel will take a look at the challenges and opportunities facing America's engagement in Africa and how these investments are helping to build more prosperous, democratic, and peaceful Africa that is open for business. And we in Delaware like the term open for business. We are joined by an outstanding list of individuals whose careers truly embody America's commitment to global leadership. General Kip Ward. General Ward served as the first commander of the U.S. Africa Command from 2007 until his retirement in 2011. At AFRICOM, he was responsible for all defense activities on the continent. He currently serves as the president and COO of Centel Corporation. General Ward is also a member of the USGLC National Security Advisory Council. Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield. From 2013 to 2017, Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield served as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs, leading the State Department's focus on the development and management of U.S. policy towards sub-Saharan Africa. Her previous assignments include serving as Director General of the Foreign Service and as Ambassador to Liberia. Today, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield is a Senior State Department Fellow at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Curtis Etherly serves as Director of Federal Government Affairs and Diplomatic Relations for the Coca-Cola Company. He also leads Coca-Cola's engagement with key diplomatic, federal, and NGO stakeholders in support of the company's business and philanthropic efforts across sub-Saharan Africa. And moderating today's discussion will be the Honorable Dan Glickman, who served as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture from 1995 to 2001. Secretary Glickman served as Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program, as a Senior Fellow for the Bipartisan Policy Center, and is today Chairman of USGLC's Board of Directors. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists to the stage.
Hello, team.
Well, let me say, you have quite a few stars in this state. I'm from Kansas. I don't know if anybody here has ever been to Kansas, probably a couple maybe, but the Kansas state slogan is "To the stars through difficulties, ad astra per aspera." And boy, Congresswoman, you are a star. Chris Coons is the star of all stars. My friend Tom Carper is one of the great stars I know. He and I served in the U.S. Congress together. You are so lucky in your state to have such a distinguished congressional delegation. It's just, you know, and I say that without being obsequious. I mean it. This is really an amazing thing to have this size of a crowd. So we have a great subject and not a lot of time, and some great people on here who have, there's a story I used to tell when I was in the agriculture department about these two dairy cows that were grazing along the side of a road, and all of a sudden a milk truck drives by, and on the side of the milk truck is written in big red letters, pasteurized, homogenized, vitamin enriched, good for you. And one dairy cow looks at the other dairy cow and says, kind of makes you feel inadequate, doesn't it?
So that's the way I feel with these people right here. They all have this great personal experience. But first of all, I want to do a little bit of a test out there. I'm going to ask you all a question, and I want you to raise your hands. So my question is, over the last 20 years, has the proportion of people living in extreme poverty around the world, has it increased, has it decreased, or has it stayed the same? So I want you all to vote. Those of you who think extreme poverty has increased over the last 20 years, raise your hands. Okay. Those who think it's been basically the same after the last 20 years, raise your hands. Those who think it has decreased over the last 20 years, raise your, well, you're giving it away, Senator. Yeah. Well, the truth is, in reality, it's been cut in half. That is a profound statistic. And it's been cut in half largely through the efforts of the public sector, through USAID, the U.S. government, the State Department, presidents, like you mentioned, President Bush and President Obama, who have cared about various issues, the U.S. military, which has led the NGO community, and the private sector, which has become more and more a part of these particular efforts. So we have three very distinguished people, and I'm just going to go one by one and forget the script, and I'm going to go to my friend here who served a remarkable career in the U.S. military, running the Africa Command, serving the military all over the world. Okay, you heard Senator Coons talk about the need for American engagement in the world. You talked about what's happening in Africa. Why is it in the interest of the United States of America to be engaged in these issues as it relates to Africa?
Well, thank you, Secretary. And I could give a one-word answer to that question, but because I've been asked to come here, I'm going to spend a bit more than that. The word is stability. That's the word, stability. And as we look at our global commons, and as I reflect upon my 40 years of wearing the cloth of our nation and being in places that caused me to see why stability was so important here at home, it was very plain to me that unless we are engaged in ways that are important not just to us but also to our partners, then these global commons won't be as we would want them to be for our children and our children's children. 25 years ago, I had been in the military at that point in time about 20 years. And I found myself in Somalia as a brigade commander as a part of Operation Restore Hope. I went there to help secure the delivery of humanitarian assistance to a disadvantaged, abused people. Very quickly, that humanitarian mission turned into a combat mission. But that's not the important thing with respect to why myself, along with over 190 retired 3- and 4-star flag officers and general officers, know that it's important for us to be advocates of a strong developmental budget, a strong diplomatic presence, to go along with a strong defense posture. So don't get me twisted there. Defense is for sure important. But the point I make is it alone is not enough. A statement was made with respect to a good friend of mine, our current Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, said with respect to if we don't fund our State Department, then we need to buy more bullets. I add a postscript to that. We can never buy enough bullets to ensure stability. These things have to work together in an integrated way, and our global leadership and presence reinforces that. I mentioned 25 years ago in Somalia and the humanitarian mission turning into a combat mission, and it was precisely because those things that would have been important to the peoples of that region as they pertain to development, food security, basic issues of health, those things weren't a part of that dynamic. Had they been, that scenario could have been totally different. And I saw it, as was pointed out, in other parts of the globe, the Middle East, Eastern Europe. So those factors and how we as a nation are involved in helping to ensure that the factors of defense, diplomacy, and development are done in an integrated fashion is in the best interest of not just the United States, but indeed these global commons that are becoming increasingly interconnected and existing in such a way that what happens in one location impacts us, because those ill effects can be felt here at home just as they are abroad.
Okay, so let me just follow up with you. Here we are in Delaware. If you had to explain how their national security interests were threatened by our failure to engage, how perhaps other countries in the world will pick up the slack if we pull back, how would you explain that?
Well, it's simple, Mr. Secretary. Those influences that would be there, if we are not present, will be taken by someone else. Will be performed by someone else. And those influences will reach our shores. And as importantly, our ability to cause what is important to us to be exported to other places from goods and services won't be readily, well, they won't be accepted. We won't be able to deliver them, and we will be limiting our ability to engage in ways that are meaningful to the people in Delaware, for the products that are made and the services that are delivered.
And are there specific countries like China that will fill this vacuum if we don't? I'm sorry to provide a leading question there.
Yes.
All right.
To be sure, if we're not there doing it, it will be done by others, and those other countries won't hold the values, certainly will not have our interest at stake in what they do, and that will be to our detriment.
Okay, well, I want to then go to, thank you, General, to one of the most distinguished career ambassadors that America's ever seen. You were in Nigeria's ambassador. You were Assistant Secretary. In Nigeria, you were Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. So tell me a little bit how you perceive, from a State Department's perspective, America's role in the world, and particularly as it relates to the development issues that we're talking about today.
Well, let me first subscribe to what General Ward said, because while the military plays an important role, it's really important that diplomats and our civilian services also be recognized for the important role that they play. And when General Ward was the Africa commander, I was the principal deputy assistant secretary in the Africa Bureau, and we were tied at the hip in trying to project America's power, not just from a military standpoint, but also from a civilian side. Now, in terms of what people expect from the United States, they expect us to be engaged. We are looked upon by the world as the leader in humanitarian affairs, as the leader in promoting good governance, as the leader in promoting democracy. And I would say that one of the things that's really important for us to know when it relates to Africa is that Africa matters. It matters to the United States, and Africa matters to the world. It's one of the fastest growing populations on the globe. It is the youngest populations on the globe. And as I look out into this, in this room, I see so many people of African descent here. If we were in China, you would not see that population sitting in the room. And that's one of the powers that we have as a country that we ignore, that we have a strong diaspora community that cares about what is happening in Africa, and that community has to continue to engage broadly with other Americans, with their elected officials, to ensure that we continue to engage in this very important continent. When I travel around the United States, people ask, why does it matter to us what is happening in Africa? And it matters for one reason, and I always use this two words, because Americans care. It's a part of our psyche. It's a part of our value system that we care about what is happening in the world. We care that poverty is being alleviated. We care that people are not hungry in the world. And the only way we can continue to do that is if we continue to engage both politically and diplomatically around the continent of Africa. People are waiting and they're watching and they want us there. And if we don't move into the spaces that have been open for us, those spaces will become more and more difficult for us, and we will start to feel the impact in the United States, whether it's terrorism, whether it's migration of people, whether it's trafficking, all of those things that are happening around the globe, but particularly in Africa, will have an impact on us here in the United States.
So you have obviously been responsible for the entire continent. You spent a lot of time in West Africa. Give us a couple examples of success stories in terms of business development, economic development, governance improvement. I mean, so we have spent a lot of resources in this area. Tell us what we've gotten out of this, basically.
You know, it's interesting to be asked that question. So I first went to Africa in 1978. In 1978, and I know many of you weren't born then, half the countries in West Africa were being run by military governments. There were coups d'etats everywhere. Ghana was in the throes of a military government. Nigeria was in the throes of a military government. I first served in Nigeria in 1985, and guess who was head of Nigeria in 1985? It was Buhari. So fast forward to today in West Africa, where we have democratic governments that have been elected by the people. Look at Nigeria, look at Ghana, look at even Liberia, and all of them are works in progress. Don't get me wrong, I'm not being Pollyannish here, but people have bought into the possibilities and the importance of democracy, and that's a success story that we don't talk about enough. Education is another success story. Again, much more needs to be done, but people understand the importance of education. Every African parent wants to have their child educated. They want them in schools. They may not have them in schools, but they're doing everything possible to make that happen. And like every American, every African parent wants to see their child live a better life and a more educated life than they had, and they want a better world for their grandchildren. And we are part of building that on the continent of Africa, and we're beginning to see dividends being paid by all of the efforts that we've made over the past 25 years on the continent.
And I'm told, I think it's half the fastest growing economies in the world are on the continent of Africa. So it's going to impact the world's economy and American economy as well. Then.
They're going to be the market. They're going to be the jobs. They are going to create the employees of the future. And so we have to be part of that. We have to be engaged in it. And it's important that the U.S. government, but American people more broadly, understand that we don't have a choice in this. We have to be engaged globally, and we have to be engaged in Africa.
So, Curtis, if you notice, there are only Coca-Cola products on your tables today, which isn't, it's because it's the best. That's why, you know. But Coke, you're, of course, involved with the foundation, but you're involved with the company as well. I believe Coca-Cola is the largest private employer in Africa. Is that correct?
That's correct.
How many people do you employ there?
Some 70,000.
Okay, so why are you there? What are you investing in, and what are the returns you're getting from it?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let me say thank you to Senator Coons and USGLC and Liz's staff, and thank you to all of you for being here, for investing your time. Why is this important? First of all, I hope many of you will not come as a shock that Coca-Cola is not new to the continent. We've been there since 1928, and as you heard me just say, some 70,000 associates across the continent as part of our bottling system. One of the largest, if not the largest, private sector employer on the continent. We get it, and we've gotten it for now some near 90 years. The reality of what we're dealing with today just reaffirms the strength and the foresight of that commitment. We're at the tail end of a second decade of investment, some $17 billion across the continent. That's triple the size of our investment from 2000 to 2010. So you're looking at some $22, $23 billion of investment across more than 140 bottling plants, across those 70,000 associates, because we recognize the importance of the marketplace on the continent, And to simply put a pin in what you've heard from both the General and the Ambassador, there is a component to soft power that also involves the economic story. And we know that a successful Africa is a prosperous Africa. And that means not only for our businesses, but as we look at investments in our supply chain in support of African businesses and African business owners, especially among those small and medium-sized enterprises, that tide is going to lift all boats. We oftentimes call it the golden triangle, and you've heard variations of this, I'm sure, where we talk about the size and the scope of the problems that we face across the globe, but most certainly on the continent itself. These problems will not be solved by government alone, they will not be solved by business alone, and they will not be solved by civil society alone. It takes all three legs of that stool, and that's what we've been trying to do on the continent for some 90-plus years.
You also have this incredible distribution network. I was in Tanzania and drove to the town of Morogoro and drove west of there into the hills. And what did I see everywhere? Coca-Cola.
Sir.
And how do you do that? How are you able to integrate your product throughout this entire continent?
Well, it comes back to the local part of the tagline that you see up on the screen there. Certainly we're an Atlanta, Georgia-based company, but the products that you hopefully enjoy on a daily basis come more likely than not from a production facility and a warehouse in your state, in your country, in your province. It comes from next door. And chances are you have a neighbor who's part of that supply chain. So most certainly our business is local. And when we talk about the importance of having a global perspective, but having it informed by very locally relevant and engaged plans across our entire business. So that's how we do it. It's a locally based business. And when we talk about all of the work that we do outside of the traditional business realm, if you will, and we like to think of it as very much part of our core business. When we talk about the work in health and medicine, when we talk about work around women's empowerment, and when we talk about work around youth empowerment and access to safe drinking water, the way we do all of those things is not by importing expertise from Atlanta or from the U.S., but by working with local partners.
Which is the China model, by the way.
Absolutely right. He's absolutely correct. So
explain that when you say it's the.
Oh my.
No. I'm just because I think it's important to talk to people about how we're so different in terms of our model of engaging.
Well, first, let me apologize to my colleague.
No.
General.
For that addendum.
This is America. We can intervene whenever we want to.
Right.
Yeah.
I wore a uniform for over 40 years to guarantee this right.
Yeah.
But when you have in the continent of Africa other countries, and we'll take China as an example, who come in and bring their perspectives, not considering what's good for the local environment, not listening to the local folks, except for those who may be manipulating the process, you get a result that doesn't satisfy the local people. And that result breeds discontent. The American model incorporates, through our focus on good governance and effective civil society, it incorporates the voice of the local citizens, the local people, to take into consideration things that are meaningful and relevant to them and what goes on. And remember the word that I said at the beginning, stability. That leads to the realization of a more stable environment, thus reducing the likelihood of discontent, thus reducing the potential that some ill-affected young man or woman would don a vest, would be persuaded to take that someplace else and detonate an explosive device. So it's about helping to produce stability in these local environments to cause folks to be more rather than less satisfied with their lot where they are, and America's presence reinforces that like no other.
I'm going to ask Ambassador a question, then I want people in the audience to feel free. I think we have roving mics somewhere, so if anybody has questions, let our team know. But ambassadors, so I want you, if you might, talk a little bit about on the ground how we as Americans are perceived, how successful we have been in some of the projects we have worked on, for example, health, capitalism, capital formation. What has our engagement actually been doing to change the lives of people?
I love that question because as General Ward was speaking as well, and he talked about stability, the other thing that our policy does on the continent of Africa and around the world is it gives people hope. Because we do engage with people, and we're working closely with people to alleviate poverty. We're working closely with people to deal with issues of health care. I remember in Liberia, my first evenings there as ambassador, driving through the streets when they got their first street lights. And young children, in the middle of the night, were sitting out under street lights studying, reading, doing homework, getting ready for school. That was brought by the efforts of USAID, working with other development agencies, working with government, working with the private sector to ensure that electricity, that power was brought to Africa. The other success story that I'd like to talk about in Delaware has been very much a part of that, and that's the Young African Leaders Initiative, where we have brought every year close to 1,000 young Africans to the United States, where they have had 6 weeks of intensive leadership training. And a group of them have come to Delaware every year in that program. People sometimes say to us, that's just a drop in the bucket. What are you doing? There are tens of thousands of young Africans. Well, what happens with this small group of 1,000 is they have a galvanizing impact. I like to refer to them as the drop of red paint in a drop of red in a bucket of white paint. They began to taint everyone around them. And now we have a program with over 400,000 and counting of young Africans on the Yali network who are engaging with each other, talking to each other, who have erased the borders of their country and are working to make Africa a better place for all. And that's a policy program that was put together by the United States that's impacting the entire continent.
Yeah, I think these success stories are very important. People need to know that people's lives are being affected positively. I've got to ask you, and then I'm going to go to the audience, kind of a political question, which I think we can both deal with now, perhaps. But, you know, Senator Coons talked about the greatness of the Feed the Future initiative under President Obama, the amazing success of the PEPFAR initiative and related health initiatives under President Bush. So, to the best you can, characterize right now the State Department and its commitment or non-commitment as it relates to these issues. Is it too soon to tell or not?
No, it's not too soon to tell. The State Department is about the people in the State Department. I'm retired.
That's why I asked you the question.
After 35 years. But there are people in the State Department who continue to be committed to ensuring that the U.S. continues to project its power, its influence, and its impact across the continent of Africa. They're looking for leadership. They're looking for initiatives. They're looking for a vision and a mission. They're looking for the next PEPFAR and Feed the Future, Empower Africa. I'd love it to be Educate Africa. There are lots of efforts that can be made in the new administration, and I'm still hopeful. I still continue to see the glass half full. It's not filling, but it's still half full, where we can project a new initiative, a new commitment to working on the continent of Africa. And it's going to require efforts, it's going to require your help. It's going to require your advocacy. It's going to require your saying to Senator Coons and others on the Hill that these things matter to us. and we want to see the legislation that you're putting forward on our development assistance program. So these are all important efforts, and you play a role in that.
Okay, so we have many people standing in line for questions, and here's all I ask you. State your name. Please don't tell us your life story, and please try to ask the question in one sentence if you can, okay? So we'll start over here.
My name is John Kilama with Kilama International Consulting Group. Since I can't use one sentence only, I'm sorry.
Then two, if possible.
Thank you for two. 60% of Africans are under 30 years old. Over 60% of the governing African countries are men over 70 years old. Leadership matters, as Senator Coons said. What I would like to see United States begin to emphasize or even get involved in is begin the process that brought people like Kofi Annan. Those kind of training in the early time of Africa contributed to some great men, great women who are leaders at that time. We lack leadership in Africa today. At a time when there is a tremendous pressure of the young people in terms of economic development. I just returned from South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Kenya, and I can see the pressure of the young people on the stability of Africa, coupled with the Chinese migration. What I like to see discussed at length by everybody is how do we develop African leaders of the future so that we can solve the very important impact of the young people in the stability
very
of Africa.
Very good question. So you have the youth bulge and also the question of leadership. Anybody want to take that?
I'd love to take that on because I absolutely agree with you. Leadership does matter. And one of the reasons we developed the Young African Leaders Initiative was to start to develop the leadership skills and mentor young people across the continent of Africa because of this amazing youth bulge. They need skills, they need encouragement, and they need support to start to prepare them to move into the leadership positions that we know they're capable of doing. And so we have to keep working to promote and to support them, but also to message to the older leaders that it's time for them to sit down. It's time for them to turn the reins of power over to their youth. And it's time for Africa to transition. Some of them are getting the message, others are missing that message, and we all have to add our voices to messaging to them that it's important. And one of the reasons I'm concerned about what is happening in the United States now is that we are not consistently conveying that message to African leaders.
And how does the private sector, and especially in terms of encouraging entrepreneurship? My experience is with one of your companies, DuPont, who has been the leader in developing techniques to help feed the world. And they seem to have done a very good job of trying to develop some of this. But doesn't the private sector have an enormous responsibility here with younger people?
Absolutely. Again, coming back to the three legs of the stool, and thank you so much, sir, for your question. For us, it's about asking ourselves, how can we take advantage of this massive global supply chain that we've been blessed to create? How can we make that an engine for economic opportunity on the continent? That means doing the work to create opportunities for young people through our YES program, which is focused on that 18 to 35 demographic, young people across 5 countries on the continent, some of which you mentioned like Kenya and Uganda and South Africa, to get them integrated into our supply chain as vendors, as entrepreneurs. Our 5x20 program, which focuses on empowering 5 million women by the year 2020, also leveraging our supply chain to create economic opportunity. And then a program like Engine in Nigeria, which focuses on girls' education, because as we know, we have a number of cultural challenges and other considerations that oftentimes sidetrack young girls on the path from education to economic empowerment. And so it's incumbent upon the private sector to look at every single opportunity and not just from an extractive standpoint. That's been the big challenge for the continent, as many of us know. The relationship has been one-sided, it's been transactional, and it's been extractive. What we have to think about and focus on is how do we use business to put back into the continent and create self-sustaining stability.
Okay. We'll take this gentleman. I think we're going to take two at a time, if possible, to try to get more. So this gentleman right here, and by the mic.
My name is Luke Fikiri Murefu. I'm a Congolese tribal leader. I'm basically the president of Congolese tribal chiefs, and I'm also a president of Congolese civil coalition of the civil society. It happened that I live in Pennsylvania, but my head is always over there in Africa, and I'm there constantly. My question really is about the figure, and I'm not arguing with the 50% reduction of poverty. I'm not arguing with that. But when I read the book of Fareed Zakaria, the post-American world, which talks about how the poverty immigrated from China. In the 60s, we used to have a 60% of poverty in China, and now in Africa, at the same time, we used to have 10%. Now Africa is up 50%, while China is 10% now. I'm just wondering, and looking at how the speed of Chinese, development and investment to Africa, I'm wondering what really the U.S., including myself because I live here, but I'm there at the same time, where the U.S. is, what is the strategy? Because China is not going back. It's going to continue to grow. Are we going to continue with the same way we've been doing business? Or are we going to really change the way we've been doing business? Because Chinese is growing. What is really the solution? Because all American, the U.S. is, the Chinese are taking the contract. Well, the U.S. are not taking the contract. And I would like to see the U.S. take the contract instead of Chinese taking the contract.
Okay, so let's take this question right here, and then we'll get both questions. Yes, sir.
Good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Kelechi Lawrence. I'm the president of Delaware Africa Coalition. It is really quite refreshing to hear what some of the panelists are talking about. I'd like to highlight the response of the ambassador with regard to some of the gains that have been made in Africa, where there are now more democratic governments over there. It has also been highlighted that China, is using cash basically to advance its interests in Africa. We all know that. Some of us have had discussions with our honorable senator here and other political leaders about the fact that while the United States may not be able to match China in terms of cash, but the United States also has something that is even more important than cash, and that's human resource. The diaspora community that is here, China doesn't have. And so my question is, how is the United States engaging, with this diaspora community in an effort to actually really help advance its foreign policy?
Okay, so I wonder if anybody here answer both of these questions, either or both.
Let me start on I'll take this question first, because he talked about how the diaspora community is being engaged. And when I was Assistant Secretary, I was constantly asked, how can we do a better job of helping the diaspora community? And I always turn that question back to the diaspora community. How can you do a better job of helping me carry out Africa policy? You have to advocate. You have to insist on policies. You have to recommend policy approaches to us. You have to write your congressmen and women to say that you're concerned about what's happening on the continent of Africa. That's what is expected of the diaspora community. And if you do that, then we can do a better job of assisting the diaspora community. On the question of China, I used to always say that China brought hardware to Africa, but hardware is not what makes the engine work. It is the software. And the software are the human resources. It's providing training, it's providing capacity, and that's what we're good at, but that doesn't have, you know, the American flag on it. Whereas the Chinese buildings all have the Chinese flag and they have the Chinese letters, and you know that this $26 million hospital or $26 million school in Liberia is built by the Chinese. But you don't know that the inner workings of these institutions are functioning because of the software that the U.S. government has provided. And then finally, I'll say that the key to China and Africa is Africans themselves. African leaders, African people are going to have to stand up and say what they need and what they want from the Chinese, because the needs are too great across the continent of Africa for the United States to provide all of it. So Africans are going to need the Chinese, but they're going to have to define how that relationship is going to evolve and what they get from that relationship.
Okay. Yes.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Barbara Simmons, and first I want to thank Mr. Torrey for inviting me to this, and I definitely have to give homage to Senator Coons, who, as a result of attending the Opportunity Africa last year, I was invited to Nigeria to Mr. Ilumilu's foundation, his conference. And we've talked about a three-legged stool. I'm wondering if we need to add another leg to that, in that I left Nigeria so encouraged because I saw there were 1,000 Africans who were being trained to become entrepreneurs. And one of the things, as U.S. citizens, we often think of Africa as only poverty-stricken. But there are some very wealthy people on the continent. And I'm wondering if we need to talk about a partnership with some of those persons to engage in the private sector with them in a way that will enable us to go forward, because I think entrepreneurship has to be a part of the solution any way you look at it.
Great question, and we'll take one over here too.
Yeah, my name is Arad Debesai. I'm here actually representing Dean Bruce Weber of the Lerner College of Business and Economics in the University of Delaware, who could not make it here due to other commitment. If you may allow me, before I ask my question, I would like to express, as someone from African heritage, I'd like to express my deep appreciation to Senator Coons for his lifetime commitment to help Africa, starting when he was a young Peace Corps volunteer, and then what he is doing now at the Senate is indeed remarkable. And so really we are very blessed in Delaware to have Senator Coons as our senator. Now my question to the panelists is this. The ambassador had expressed how the US has played a role in democratizing many African countries. And that is indeed very encouraging. And we see now there is a movement towards more democratic countries in Africa. But it breaks my heart, when my own native land is being referred as the North Korea of Africa. I'm from Eritrea, and Eritrea is now one of the, in fact, the largest refugee-producing country for its size, because we have the most oppressive president in the country. And so my question is, really, what can the US do to really democratize and introduce the rule of law in some of the dictatorial countries that are still prevailing in Africa? Thank you very much.
So we have a question on basically wealthier Africans, what can be done to encourage more capitalism and entrepreneurship in Africa, and then also a question about refugees in Eritrea and perhaps related countries. You want to?
Sure. I'll start with the gentleman's question here and then come back to the question from this side. As a gentleman who was blessed to be able to marry up and marry an Eritrean woman, I'm happy to speak a little bit as part of the family, sir. I'm going to defer to my much more experienced colleagues on kind of, shall we say, the political challenge. But I think one of the things that we can talk to in terms of the private sector, this notion of helping to build institutions and support institutions around knowledge. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield referred to it a little bit, The work that we do around women's empowerment, the work that we do in support of the Yale African Women Leaders Program, the work that we do in our Project Last Mile context, this is all work where we bring in, be it an African woman entrepreneur, either a new startup entrepreneur or an existing one. We bring in young people and we help with that skills transfer. To an extent, this also comes back to the China question that was raised earlier, because I think as you've heard us allude to, part of the challenge with the Chinese proposition is those are Chinese workers that are brought in to do the projects, and then that goes back to China. In terms of empowering skills for African workers and laborers who can then take those skills for ongoing business concerns, you don't see that as much. But when you look at the work that we try to do with many of our NGO partners, that's the fundamental undercurrent of our work. So to an extent, it's a little bit of continuing to highlight that type of exposure to American know-how, American expertise, teach it, leave it, let it grow, help to nurture it, fund it, all of the above. With respect to the issue of incorporating the tremendous wealth that you have on the continent, you're absolutely correct there. For us, from a franchise standpoint, whether it's someone like Stride Misiawa, whether it's someone like Tony Elumelu, whether it's someone like Liko Dangote, the list goes on. And we are most certainly working with their foundations, with other aspects of all of their broad corporate interests to leverage that same notion of taking advantage of the supply chain, taking advantage of their extensive network so we can just expand all of this great work outward. It has an exponential effect, and it's an excellent question, Ms. Simmons. Thank you so much, and good to see you.
Thank you. I tell you, one of our problems is we have three groups, panels, so I'm going to have to, I'm sorry, not able to take any more questions, but we will the panel will be around for a while, but I want to ask each one of you the following question. If you were the President's lead advisor on Africa, assuming there is one, but assuming you're the person, what would you tell him that we need to do? What's the 1, 2, and 3 priorities? Start with you, General.
Well, we need to be engaged. We need to be engaged in a way that is meaningful to those with whom we are engaging. And that means we have to listen to them first to understand the scenarios from their perspective. And then based on our own interests, in a partnering way, in a partnership, cause activities across the developmental sphere, the diplomatic sphere, and to be sure the security sphere to be integrated such that we have a greater rather than a less chance of achieving stability that will cause populations in those areas be satisfied where they are, to have what I call a horizon of hope for their children and grandchildren, and to cause them to know that their government or those with whom they have invested governing authority is acting in their best interest.
So would you advise the President to take a trip over the next year to Africa like President Obama and President Bush did?
I think part of engaging is, I have this notion, virtual presence is actual absence. You have to be there and get to know people and build relationships.
Ambassador, so you're in a cabinet room all by yourself with the President.
I would say, Mr. President, Africa matters. And you must pay attention to what is happening on this continent. And I would stress that it's a diverse continent, 54 countries, with amazing opportunities for America to engage, but also for American businesses to thrive, which matters to this president as well. But for American businesses to thrive, we have to do that part that General Ward is talking about. We have to ensure stability, we have to build confidence, and we have to ensure that African people, children, have hope. And we have done that over many generations. Both Republican and Democratic administrations have engaged on this continent, and it is important that we continue.
Curtis?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I would say, Mr. President, America's global competitiveness is inextricably tied to the continent. There's no way to get around that proposition. How do you realize the full potential of that relationship? You have to focus on women. You have to focus on youth. It's been alluded to, the youth demographic, the youth bulge that is happening on the continent. And from our perspective, you have to focus on water. Those three things.
I'm sorry, water?
Water, I'm sorry. Access
we haven't
to
talked
safe
about
drinking
water
water.
very
We haven't
much.
touched it.
Yeah.
But from the standpoint of talking about the unique intersection of women, youth, and access to safe drinking water, it is oftentimes at the heart of so much of what we see on the continent. We have to be talking in those three areas, I think primarily, if we're going to continue to help the continent, work with the continent as a partner towards realizing its full potential. And that's a key word that I'll end with here. This relationship, when we talk about the U.S., when we talk about Africa, it can't be a paternalistic relationship. It can't be one where it's student-teacher. It has to be co-equal partnership where both are at the table talking about shared and common solutions.
Well, I would just say, just in summary, I think what you've heard from three outstanding people is that Africa is in America's interest. It is not to be neglected. Within 20 or 30 years, Africa will probably be every bit as important, not only to itself, but to the rest of the world and to America, as the other regions that we are focusing on right now. And I don't think anybody knows that more than Senator Coons, who's taking this message not only to Delaware, but around the country. And it is making a big, big difference. So saying that, let's give the panelists a hand and appreciate their being here. I'm sorry, my eyesight is, I've got to have cataract surgery actually next month, so it's not quite as good as it ought to be. I didn't get everybody recognized, but hopefully you'll be able to talk to everybody. We're going to have a 10-minute stretch break. Does that mean there's an exercise break? Okay. And then we will resume at 10:30. Thank you all very much.
Check 1, 2. Hey, hey, hey. This is 4. Hey, hey. And you have 5. Hey, 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 hey. Hey, hey. Check 1, 2, 2. Hey, hey. Hey, hey.
Hey, Kai.
Let me go get a spot for that one.
Sorry.
Oh boy. Let's see what. One thing that they said, how do we connect with local communities? I got the education. Oh, I thought the education. But I wanted to ask how they felt the shift was. If you look back today, we tried to do something in the broad sense. It wasn't necessarily, I mean, we had the resources still pretty local. It was trying to change it from the top down, not the bottom up.
If I could ask everyone to please take your seats. We're about to resume the program. If you would please take your seats. Thank you very much.
We're going to ask everyone to take their seats. Please take your seats so that we can go on with the program. Could I ask everyone to take your seats, please?
Can I invite everybody to please take their seat? Well, I opened, so I could do it. I'm Liz Schreier. Thank you so much. We're going to get the program started again. I know everybody's so enjoying the networking time. We'll have another break after the next panel. But if we can invite everybody to sit down, we have a marvelous next panel. Everybody's excited to enjoy each other's company. I'm going to turn it over to our opener of our next panel.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Patrice Gilliam Johnson, Secretary of Delaware Department of Labor, and I'm so very pleased and honored to be here with you all today to participate in this essential conversation. I'd like to thank Senator Coons for asking me to participate and for all that he's done in this particular area. It's no secret that today we live in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. In Delaware, where each day we see more and more people from across the globe come to our state to explore opportunities, we recognize that this movement goes a long way toward aiding in the important work of bridging the gap between the United States and the rest of the world. From my perspective as the head of the state agency charged with tracking the impact and progress related to this, we are pleased to play a role in this critical international development. And in our work at Labor, we recognize the natural byproducts of such activities as healthy international relations, which plays part and parcel to what we will be discussing during this conversation. Our next panel will be exploring the critical role that foreign assistance plays in the numerous humanitarian crises around the world, reflecting the commitment of America and our allies to building a better, safer, and more prosperous world. I now have the pleasure of introducing the distinguished speakers who will guide us in this timely conversation. First, Nancy Lindberg. Nancy, sir, could we give her a hand to welcome her? Nancy serves as president of the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she oversees the institution's efforts to provide practical solutions for preventing and resolving violent conflict around the globe. She previously served as the assistant administrator for the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at USAID, and served as the president of Mercy Corps. So could we welcome her to the panel. Next, we have Rachel Glenister. Rachel was recently appointed the chief economist for the United Kingdom's Department for International Development, where she will begin on January 1st. She currently served as the executive director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. She previously worked for Her Majesty's Treasury and for the International Monetary Fund. So could we welcome her, please? Next, we have Carolyn Roan. Carolyn serves as the Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Reputation at Pfizer and as President of the Pfizer Foundation. Overseeing Pfizer's corporate responsibility, Carolyn has built Pfizer's corporate responsibility strategy to expand healthcare capacity and improve health access around the world. And during her tenure, the company has improved its product donation programs and works more effectively in emerging markets. So could we welcome her to the panel? And moderating today's discussion will be U.S. Global Leadership Coalition Executive Director, Jason Gross. Ladies and gentlemen, again, please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Thank you, Secretary Gilliam Johnson, for those opening remarks, and they really help frame, I think, the discussion that we want to hold now on America's role in the world, on our global challenges. We want to build on, I think, what was a really compelling discussion we had in the first panel about Africa and take a look at it through a global lens. Our discussion today comes at a very important time, I think, for those in this room who are concerned about America's role in the world and the significant, unprecedented, simultaneous challenges we face across the globe. Liz Schreier outlined some of those numbers in her opening remarks, but let's review them for a moment. 65 million displaced persons and refugees in the world today, the highest number since World War II. 30 million facing 4 famines spread across the Middle East and Africa today. And 100 million people across the globe who are food insecure, who will go to bed tonight not knowing where their next meal might come from tomorrow. These are significant challenges that we have today as a nation, as a compassionate nation as we are, and one who is a world leader of the free world. So our panelists today are going to discuss about how our work around the world is not only important to reinforce, to reflect our values as a people, but also to advance our national security interests. So let's get this conversation moving. We're going to get to your questions a little later. Let's start our discussion here. And please continue to engage on social media. You're doing a great job so far, the USGLC DE hashtag. We had a great conversation on social media. But let me turn over to Nancy Lindborg first. Nancy, one important aspect of America's global leadership is to engage and to help when natural disasters, when crises strike. Americans are very familiar with what's happened recently with hurricanes hitting Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico. But when America leads globally, it's about responding to earthquakes in Nepal or Haiti, mudslides in West Africa, tsunamis in Indonesia. From your extensive experience in this field, we heard before, heading up Mercy Corps, leading the Humanitarian Relief Bureau at USAID, and now as president of U.S. Institute of Peace. How do you see this as both important for us, our moral expression as a country, but how does this also mean when we provide relief, when we engage, when USAID is the first on the ground in these countries to lead efforts about our long-term national security?
Thanks, Jason, and it's terrific to be here with everybody. Thanks to Senator Coons for hosting us. Let me start by noting that the U.S. has capabilities that few others do, both in terms of the teams who can deploy out of USAID, as well as our military capabilities. And if you look at disasters like the Philippines, Haiyan typhoon, there was a need to get in with big lift capacities right away to bring life-saving food and water. And the U.S. military was able to do that, working very closely with our USAID teams, and it served as a bridge until our international partners, UN and other countries, could get in there, and until the local capacities could come together. And so what we do is both provide this essential life-saving potential and also help catalyze other responses globally. And on the national security front, my second point is I was the lead for USAID in 2014 when the Ebola crisis struck West Africa, the 3 West African countries. And it really wasn't until the U.S. fully mobilized that we were able to help galvanize a global, serious response. And the State Department's full-time job was on the phone to coordinate and to get others to do a response. The military and AID were on the ground trying to get ahead of what was a very scary epidemic that, as we saw, reached our shores. And so we were lucky with Ebola. As our NIH friends say, it was actually a wimpy virus, but there could be more in the future. And it's important that we continue to have those capabilities, that we continue to be able to work in partnership. In that instance, the Brits took the lead in Sierra Leone, the French took the leads in Guinea, we took the lead in Liberia and provided resources across the 3 countries that supported that response. And then finally, I would note on the moral front that these responses tap deeply into core values of the American public. And if you look at public opinion polls, the U.S. public strongly supports our role in doing this. This is who we are as a people to respond at times of need. And I would close with a story that for me really underscores the power of that kind of helping hand. And when I was still with Mercy Corps, and Mercy Corps was working on the ground in Iraq, providing assistance, at the time that Katrina hit. And the Iraqi staff got together and they collectively raised from their own very meager salaries in comparison, about $2,000, and sent that money to help those in need in Katrina. And it's really about that spirit and promoting that kind of value base that is one of the most important things that we do with our global leadership.
That's worth it. Values and security. And when we talk about unique assets in this country, as Nancy said, we have our strong corporate leadership in our community. Caroline, you're the Vice President for Corporate Responsibility at Pfizer. Pfizer is one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies with a strong commitment to providing access to medicines in some of the most remote places in the world. Tell us how your company partners with NGOs, with the public sector sometimes, to help deliver medicines to help prevent where some 3 million people a year die from preventable diseases through vaccines and your work around the world.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Senator Coons, for hosting us. And USGLC, I'm a proud board member, so it's great to be here in the great state of Delaware. So as you probably know, Pfizer is a global pharmaceutical company. We discover, develop, and bring to market medicines and vaccines that help people live longer and healthier lives. And we depend mightily on the U.S. government, USAID in particular, but also a number of NGO partners to ensure that those medicines and vaccines get to the most remote locations and the most vulnerable communities. And I think a perfect example to illustrate that is our partnership with USAID through the Neglected Tropical Disease Group. And for many of you who aren't health experts, you may not know that there are a number of diseases that still plague especially countries that have very weak infrastructure and are quite poor. And the WHO has listed them. There's 17 of them. Pfizer's made a commitment to eliminate a disease called blinding trachoma. It's an infectious disease of the eye, and we donate our Zithromax to treat active infection. But that's not sufficient. It's a comprehensive public health strategy, and USAID is our partner in that program. And with a focus on impact and toward the goal of global elimination of this disease by the year 2020, we did some impact studies with USAID. And what we discovered was that for every dollar that USAID supported in terms of the distribution of these medicines, not just Pfizer's, but the entire industries, they leveraged $26 in donations by global pharmaceutical companies. To me, that's a best buy in public health, and it matters because we know when communities get the health care they need, and when women and moms are healthy, it means we have a better chance at stability and economic development, and it's been a fantastic partnership. And we depend on a number of the USGLC companies, NGOs that are involved with us to get these medicines to the most remote locations, and we'll talk more about some of those examples.
Great. Rachel, before you join up with DFID to become their chief economist, you've been working at MIT's Global Poverty Action Lab, called JPAL, and we heard Caroline give some data and stats. This is something that you and your colleagues there have really focused in on looking at thorough data analysis, scientific research, to really analyze what is working in the world of poverty reduction. So tell us how your work there has been so important for making these programs work. And I think also think about stepping outside this audience to some of the skeptics outside of this room, both in the US and the UK, who would probably concede there are problems with global poverty, but maybe aren't convinced yet that these programs are effective yet. To speak to that audience of skeptics about how your research has been working.
Yeah, great, thanks. And wonderful to be here, and thank you to Senator Coons for inviting us. As you say, I run a center at MIT, but we have 150 academics around the world who do this research onto what's the most effective way to reduce poverty. So why is it important to do this kind of testing? Well, the reason is that often our intuitions may not be right about what's the most effective approach. And let me just give you an example to illustrate. We've done over 200 randomized controlled trials to test what's the best way to improve education in poor countries. And we were surprised to find one of the most cost-effective approaches was providing mass deworming for children. So this is a pill that costs, a cent and can be given very cheaply through schools in areas where these parasitic worms are endemic. And we found that when children were treated for these parasitic worms, they came to school much more often. And, compared to providing textbooks or many other different classic approaches that you would think of education, it was actually improving their health that did most to improve their education. So we take that finding and then we bring it to governments, to NGOs, and advocate for the scale-up of things that are being found to be effective. So in this case, pharmaceutical companies have donated those pills, And we now reach, and US aid has helped us train people in countries around the world to do this program, when there's now 190 million children last year were treated with deworming pills through education, partly because of that evidence that this health approach they should be doing in schools because it helped education. So that's one of the ways that we talk about, you know, not every aid program works, but when you find these incredibly cost-effective approaches, they can, and you then scale up based on the evidence, you can make a huge difference.
Nancy, when we talk about national security, global security, food security comes in the conversation so often too. It certainly was with our first panel. When we talk about those 100 million food insecure people around the world, a number of them in sub-Saharan Africa, but they're across the world. How is that a part of national security, looking at long-term food security, both in relief that we provide when there is famine happening, and long-term agricultural development that might sustain capacity in Africa and look to be an economic driver as well?
Well, we've seen a very distressing rise in the last several years in the number of people who are food insecure and hungry. And it's very linked in countries that are either battered by natural disasters, especially droughts and floods, as well as countries that are consumed by conflict. And there was just a very heartbreaking story this morning in the Washington Post about young boys who have actually left militias in South Sudan only to seek to return because they have nothing to eat. You know, so the food insecurity has direct national security implications for us and for our allies, because those are the people who decide to leave. If you have no prospects for feeding your family or for feeding yourself, there is a much greater likelihood that you'll join the millions and millions of people who have made quite treacherous journeys across the Mediterranean into Europe. And we saw last summer how that destabilized our allies. It sparked very difficult debates in this country. And you know, it's a question all of us need to think about. What would you do if you literally could not feed your families? There's been a great deal of additional investment in seeking the kinds of crops that enable farmers to withstand greater cycles of drought. And in fact, in the Horn of Africa in 2012, that drought, even though it happened in the marginalized areas of Kenya, it still cost that country $13 billion of economic impact. And in response, AID, working with the local governments and other international partners, really moved to create greater resilience in the face of what we see are droughts happening faster and faster. In fact, a very terrible drought hit again in the same area this year. And despite the severity, we're seeing that in those areas where there was investment in alternative crops, in different kind of care of livestock, that they have not had to uproot themselves at the same levels as other communities. So it's important that we get ahead of these disasters and look for ways to help communities and families cope so that they don't have to leave their homes and join these great waves of migration out of their country. Nobody wants to leave their homes, but sometimes there's a very difficult choice for them. We can help them stay there.
So Nancy talked about agricultural development having to address political, environmental instability that's caused. Caroline, let's turn to you to talk about a success story we touched on in the first panel too, about addressing a health crisis, and that's the story of PEPFAR. You in the health field too. I think it's something where it's just remarkable, the accomplishments with it. 10 years ago, we're talking about life-saving treatment to 12 million people, counseling for over 74 million people. I think even among advocates, it's hard to say, to really appreciate the legacy of President Bush and this program of making a difference in Africa. Can you tell us more about this, remarkable success story?
Sure. Well, I think all of you and President Bush and all of us should feel very proud of PEPFAR. It has just been transformative in the lives of HIV patients. And for Pfizer, when the epidemic started, we didn't have any antiretrovirals. We had an antifungal called diflucan. And Pfizer made that available, like many pharmaceutical companies did, to treat opportunistic infections associated with the disease. But that said, I think PEPFAR was that great example of a model of taking it to scale. And not only just looking at the products, but the surround sound of building the system of healthcare delivery, of testing, of counseling, of training of physicians and healthcare providers. And I think when you fast forward today, first we need to stay the course, because HIV and AIDS is not over, and we should not consider it a completed task, far from it. So we need to really remain committed to that fantastic program. But I think as the industry and as healthcare professionals think about the future, we also need to take learnings from PEPFAR and pivot to what we're seeing in terms of the growth of non-communicable diseases on the continent, cancer. You've also got a number of issues from emerging markets, which used to always be infectious. And now we were just saying behind the scenes, what are we going to do about cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and some of these other diseases that are now emerging as people are able to live longer. We need to make sure we have a primary healthcare system that functions and is working, and we've seen that in the conversation about Ebola and other infectious diseases. So I think PEPFAR serves as a great example of things that have worked, and we really need to study that and understand it as we take on the future in terms of the needs in emerging markets overall and Africa specifically.
Rachel, talk about making a difference in investing, and we talk about the success U.S. and its allies have had in terms of maternal and child health. But also I think about investing in women and girls in education. I think the studies show that that can be the key to unlocking a successful economy, is by investing in women and girls' long-term education in all kinds of areas to make a difference. Can you talk to us also about that, about what your research has shown and maybe what you're going to be doing at DFID in terms of encouraging that type of investment long-term?
Yeah, so, I mean, in some ways it's completely obvious to say that, you know, our economies can never reach the potential that they, or, you know, the economies and society can't reach their potential if we're not investing in half the population. I mean, it's just, it's a human tragedy, but it's also incredibly inefficient to ignore half your talent pool. So let me just talk about a few, you know, specific examples. Coming back to HIV, one of the most important transmission mechanisms for HIV across the continent of Africa is relationships between younger girls and older men. And if we could just break that into generational relationships, we could actually end this disease. And so what's key in preventing those dangerous relationships is education. It's just proved to be one of the most effective ways to keep girls in school. They then don't have these relationships with older men, which is absolutely critical to the disease. So you get these kind of unexpected feedback mechanisms. It's also more educated women are much more politically active. And we've talked about the importance of stability and strengthening democracy. And yet you can't have effective democracy if you have a population that can't participate and they feel very unconnected to the political system. So if we're going to get more engagement in politics, strengthening the foundations of democracy, educating women is extremely important. And then another encouraging thing we found is that once you get this positive feedback loop. So when there are more economic opportunities for women in a country, we see that communities themselves invest more in young girls. So outside Delhi, we had a study where people went and told communities about good paying jobs that are available in Delhi for women. And those communities, you know, reduced malnutrition for girls and kept girls in school longer. So you get this very encouraging positive feedback loop. If you invest in education, then you get these economic returns. And when you get more economic opportunities, people invest more in girls and women.
And when we had the conversation, our next conversation with Senator Coons and USAID Administrator Green, his background from the International Republican Institute and democracy is a key part for that inclusion, about that key vector to try and build stability through greater governance, through stronger governance too, really key in including women in that is a really important point. Nancy, you wrote a recent op-ed, bipartisan, with Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State under President Clinton, Steve Hadley, President Bush's National Security Advisor, on the significant challenge of fragile states that our nation is going to face in the future. Fragile state population expected to reach 2 billion people by the year 2030. How does the U.S. work to prevent these weak and fragile states from deteriorating into failed states, which then send conflict, export conflict outside of its borders, eventually threatening us here at home?
I think this is a critical threat that we need to address, and one of the key points of the op-ed is that it really requires that bipartisan consensus, that we have a long history in this country of working in bipartisan ways to address offshore threats. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which Senator Coons is an important member of, really still, I think, embodies that spirit. And the challenge of fragile states, and let me just define fragile, and that's countries where there is a broken relationship between the state and the society, where the government either isn't able to meet the needs of their citizens or doesn't want to, is repressive, and it imprisons people often for speaking their minds. And those are the same states that have the higher incidence of global extremism, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of refugees and immigrants leaving their shores. And so there's an important rationale for why we would want to focus on these difficult challenges. And it will take global partnerships, and it will take working to invest in the ways that Carolyn just mentioned, of greater empowerment of women, and I would say youth as well. All of these countries have enormous populations that are under the age of 30, and they are often greatly disenfranchised, and they can either be part of a continuing violent future, or they can disrupt what are often generations of conflict that continue on and on. And I just got back from India over the weekend, where I was with 25 youth leaders from 13 different conflict countries, all of whom have been through terrible experiences, but they've all chosen to be peace builders in their communities instead of re-entering into the kind of patterns of conflict. As we noted in the op-ed, the U.S. can't tackle this alone. It's why it's so important to have partnerships, and it's so important to understand when you have a partner in those countries, whether it's civil society or governments. But for us to ignore that challenge is to stay on the cycle of having to be responsive instead of trying to get upstream. And let me just close by saying, we started by talking about the natural disasters. A decade ago, 80% of our global humanitarian assistance went to victims of natural disaster. So a decade later, that has flipped, and 80% of our global humanitarian assistance goes to victims of violent conflict. We spend a lot of our resources on being reactive. We need to get upstream. And there's some good examples of when we've done that in a bipartisan manner over time, because these are challenges that are not resolved in 4-year political packages. So it really takes staying the course and understanding that change is possible, and that we can have an important role in helping make that happen.
I want to get to your questions shortly. If you could, the standing mics right there to ask some questions of our panel. I want to ask Rachel a question before we get to that on environmental sustainability, and thinking about 3 billion people in the developing world that depend on fisheries, on their forest for their livelihood. How do we integrate this idea of looking at the long term to address proactively environmental challenges as population rates begin to soar, as climate begins to affect, to integrate that look at sustainability environmentally with long-term economic and political development policy?
Yeah. And this is a huge challenge. Two places I work are already being affected in a very serious way by climate change. So in the Sahelian region in West Africa, I work in Burkina Faso, and you see how the spread of the Sahara south is leading to more conflict and challenge amongst those communities who are trying to scratch a living there and getting pushed down, down as the Sahel approaches. And we've already lost US military members to the conflict that arises as a result. The other place is Bangladesh, where you literally have 160 million people crowded in a tiny floodplain. And they are already, Bangladesh floods a lot, most years, but you're getting more extreme floods. And the fact that this population is on the border of an increasingly anti-Muslim India, you know, if we see those floods continue and we see 160 million or even tens of millions flood into India, I mean, it's just a very scary political situation. So what can we do about it? One of the things we've been doing is working with developing country governments to improve their regulations, their environmental regulations, and their approaches to climate change. Because developing countries actually also provide a lot of the solution, in the sense that some of the most cost-effective ways to address climate change exist in developing countries. Because the regulation is so bad at the moment, even small changes can produce enormous benefits. So we've partnered with the Indian government to look at small changes in their regulation that dramatically reduced pollution. And I think that kind of partnership is really the way forward, because we can see these big changes, because we are going to suffer the consequences if we see the destabilization continue that is already happening in the developing world.
Well, let's get you all involved in the conversation too. We've had some great talk so far. Please ask you two things. Please tell us who you are, and please keep it to a question so we can get to, a brief question, so we can get to as many of you as possible, and also give our great panelists time to answer as many as possible. So why don't we start over here first?
Thank you. My name is Ka Wala. I am from Cameroon, and I live in Cameroon, and thank you, my friend Osage Imasoge, for bringing me here today. The panel, I think, is just now getting, thankfully, to the root of the problem, because the root of the problem is governance in our countries. And I often say, as an African, Africa is not poor. We don't need Chinese to build stadiums and hospitals and so on. We are just poorly run. And I think there needs to be a recognition that the majority of Africans are dissatisfied with this situation. We put our lives on the line. I speak to you as somebody who is arrested regularly, who is kidnapped regularly, because I stand up against a government that is repressive. And I think where we need U.S. global leadership is zero tolerance on repressive governments. We are still a world that invites people who violate human rights to global discussions, to tables where they are respected and where they are, you know, given all the honors, when they just put somebody who has a different political opinion from them in jail or shot at them the day before.
So that's a great question.
So for U.S. global leadership, the question is, how, as the U.S., are you going to lead this zero tolerance on repressive governments? Are you going to engage with leaders like myself and the many others who put their lives on the line? These are complex problems. We're not expecting you to solve them for us. We are in the lion's den solving it for ourselves. But how do you partner with us? Because unfortunately, the status quo, the current situation, is you end up supporting and maintaining these repressive governments.
Thank you. It's a great opening question. Great opening question. Let's pair it with one here, and then we'll have a panelist answer two at a time.
Yes. My name is Sharon Baker, and I worked in Western Africa with the Carter Center on the guinea worm eradication program. It's been tremendously successful, and I wondered what you see as the role of the NGO now and moving forward.
So two questions to start off with. One of the importance of governance, especially in Africa, but obviously writ large for our foreign policy, role of NGOs going forward as well. Let's start.
I'm literally at the moment in the middle of partnering with people in local political parties in Sierra Leone on how to strengthen democracy, and I couldn't agree more with the first question of the importance of this, and that it's about partnership. And I think that's something which is really unique to America. And we're talking about what's Americans' leadership role. But as I go from country to country, the number of groups from the US who are helping strengthening, not just do you have an election, but all the way down the system for democracy. How do you engage people? How do you inform people about how their politicians are doing? And we see this incredible response, and this is something I've studied as an academic. And you see that as people have more information about their politicians, they are better able to hold them to account. So we did a randomized trial of this in the last Sierra Leonean election, and we found that politicians who were part of debates actually then performed better and were less corrupt once they were in office. And we're working with the political parties in Sierra Leone now to have popular involvement in selecting who the candidates for politicians are. So this is not what we normally think about of aid, but this is actually one of the most crucial things that the US does, is help build these basic standards, the basic building blocks of democracy. Not just do we have a presidential election, but we have people engaged in the political process throughout the whole process of politics. And I think that's critically important for African development more broadly.
Governance, NGOs?
Yeah, so amen to everything that the speaker from Cameroon noted. I agree that I think that poor governance is the heart of the fragility challenge that I mentioned earlier, and that this is critical to sustaining our development investments and ensuring that we don't have to keep going in over and over again, because you lose some of these investments when a conflict overturns communities and families. Madeleine Albright called herself a principled pragmatist, and I think that these are complicated problems, and you need to think carefully about how to address them. But Rachel, you noted one of the important ways. We need to understand that democracy is more than just the election. We often go in too late and leave too early. That it is all these other ways to have inclusive engagement of who's ever not at the table, whether it's a marginalized ethnic group, religious group, women or youth, and that bringing them into the conversation is absolutely key, and enabling for their voice to be heard. I would note that technology offers us some interesting ways, both for tackling some of the terrible corruption that's at the root of this, some interesting ways that citizens are able to track resource flows in ways that were not possible before, holding members of their government to account. One of the things that U.S. Institute of Peace does is a lot of research on how elections, how to prevent election violence, because that's often a trigger in these countries, and how to work both before and after elections to mitigate that. This is absolutely the core, and investing in the next generation who will have a different commitment to a better future in their own countries is key. At the end of the day, it will require supporting the vision of people in those countries themselves. The U.S. can't do it, but we can support those who are committed to doing so. And programs that the U.S. government does, like the Young Africa Leaders Initiative, or YALI, is a terrific way to bring the voices and the hope of the next generation forward.
Definitely had a good conversation in the first panel. Let's take two more questions. Please have them as questions, though, too, so we have plenty of time to answer. We'll start on this side first, please, sir.
Good morning. My name is Michael Lynch. I just have a question with regards to the situation in Yemen. There's a humanitarian crisis in Yemen that is rarely spoken of in the media, and I'm hearing that there's a famine that's taking place that's probably the worst in decades. Can you guys speak on that, please?
Good. Question on Yemen, and from this side, please.
Yes, good morning. My name is Echiazu Ogu. I would like to acknowledge Senator Coons for his leadership on Africa and to Delaware. Specifically, most recently, he brought the nimble organization headquartered here in Delaware. NIMBLE, for those who are not familiar with it, is the National Institute for Innovation in Manufacturing Biologicals. It's a multi-million-dollar nationwide project, and I acknowledge Senator Coons for that.
Right.
Now, my question is this. PEPFAR has been astoundingly successful, 11 million lives saved. But even as we speak, there are millions more who cannot access antiretroviral treatment. They are ready, they are willing. It's not enough medicine to go around. How do we address that? Now, secondly, the HIV/AIDS epidemic cuts into the young population of these developing countries, particularly in Africa. So you have the young people dying early, and we have all these wars we're fighting. The U.S. assistance has shifted from fighting floods and such to trying to keep peace.
It's a great question there.
So question, how do we advance, how do we go to the next stage?
Absolutely.
To bring peace and address the HIV epidemic, which is still a problem? Thank you.
Why don't we answer this in reverse order? Start with the PEPFAR. We've had the success in PEPFAR, still more to do. What are our next steps?
So first, of course, prevention is the most important component of this. And I think there are many organizations that are still standing up and fighting for prevention across the board, whether it's in Africa or here in the United States. We need to prevent infections, and we need to fund those efforts in order to make that happen. I know for Pfizer, we're working with the Centers for Disease Control to evolve and think about the new science that's been brought to bear in the past decade around what's working in terms of cryptococcal meningitis, which is a product that we have. We have a product that treats that, which is an opportunistic infection for HIV/AIDS. So to reassure you that from my perspective, the global dialogue continues. We can't lose sight of the fact that still people cannot access those treatments and that there's not enough prevention dollars, and we do our best to advocate on behalf of that and those patients and those folks who need it, because we need to keep that next generation safe. So I would say that. And just one comment about the role of NGOs, and I think that's really critical. You referenced President Carter's leadership in the Carter Center. We cannot underestimate what that center has done to advance the work in neglected tropical diseases. We count them a partner in trachoma. And I would just say that for NGOs, I would encourage all of you who run NGOs to think about the inflection point where you are. Every business is changing. Technology is changing everything that we do every day. We all need to bring that to the nonprofit sector as well. I always like to say there have been a fair number of mergers and acquisitions in my industry. When you think about your work in NGOs, are you really partnering and leveraging fully? And I think USGLC does a great job to share those best practices.
No less complex subject of Yemen as well, PEPFAR. So do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Yemen is a terrible tragedy that gets not enough attention in terms of the level of humanitarian suffering and the complexity of that problem. I visited in 2012 and was shocked at, even then, before the current conflict, there was something like 40% levels of malnutrition and stunting. And remember that if you don't get adequate nutrition in 0 to 2 years old, your brain never fully develops, and you never fully gain both the cognitive and physical development that is so critical to a fully functioning adult. It's become multifold worse since then, and we're seeing, even in the last few days, the ports are threatened to be closed, and life-saving essential food and water is not getting in to people who need it. So this is a crisis that is very complicated by regional interest, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE. It's an ongoing conflict that it's critical to stop it for the sake of the Yemenis, or at a minimum, enable humanitarian assistance to get in to meet some urgent needs, which is the U.S. has contributed to humanitarian assistance. The UN and NGO partners are trying hard to get in. And much more needs to be done. Thank you for the question.
We have time for one more audience question. We have a gentleman there.
Good morning. My name is Amos Tarling. I hail from Liberia, of course, U.S. citizen now. I must say in this public manner express my deepest gratitude to the international community for saving Liberia from itself. And Senator Coon has always been in Monrovia. I know he has seen the broken promises, the broken country, and Liberia and America have had a long-term relationship. And I think Liberia's survival depends solely on the United States input. So my question is, the recent election of 20 political parties and affiliations is a recipe for problems. So how can the U.S. influence, curtail to real people who mean well for our country, who can put their country first? Because everybody wanting to be president, they got solutions, but there is no answer. So my prayer, Senator Coon again, how can the United States play a leading role to bring peace, the durability of peace to Liberia so that it can save itself? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Rachel, do you want to talk Liberia?
So I have to say first that while I've spent a lot of time in the neighboring country of Sierra Leone, I have not spent a lot of time have not visited Liberia. But I think there's a lot of common history there. I go back to the importance of the US role in, we're not simply sort of providing aid and walking away. Aid has to be about strengthening local government systems. So whether that's from the political side, which I've talked about, to the capacity on the healthcare side, this is a really important way to see aid as we're going in to try and strengthen the ability of a country to deal with the problems itself. And something that we, I think, fail to recognize is that the vast majority of money that goes to support anti-poverty programs in the world actually comes from developing countries themselves. And aid is a relatively small part of the total contribution, but it's a really important part if it can help those governments spend their money more effectively. And I think that's what we should be aiming for. So the kind of example that I gave before about the deworming was we were going in to provide technical assistance to the government to help run the program themselves. And now across India, they're paying for that program on their own. And now Liberia is away from that, but that's where we're aiming to get to. That aid is going to help the governments improve their own systems to support their population. And I think that's actually a big part of the role of what we do, and is the only way to build a sustainable and effective continent.
We've had a great conversation up here, a great dialogue with you in the audience about what America's global leadership means for the world. Let me close here by taking a step back a few decades and thinking of that classic movie, It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Stewart is George Bailey. I want to ask my panelists a close question about thinking of if the United States were George Bailey, were taken away, what would a world look like without American leadership right now to tell us how important it is? Big question, old movie. Nancy, start us off.
Well, let me answer it this way.
Okay.
Because I feel like we've been talking a lot about, conflict and gloom and doom. And I want to note, and it's a way of answering this, that in fact, over the last 70 years, there has been remarkable global progress, just incredible progress in terms of advances on fundamentals of maternal health, education, access to, water. And it's also become less violent. We've had very few conflicts between states, and the number of deaths due to violent conflict have steadily decreased. What we're seeing now is a little uptick, and we're rightly paying close attention to it. And we need to pay close attention to it because the U.S. role in accomplishing those long decades of progress was key. In terms of working with the international system, establishing a system that was based on some core shared values. Now is the time to double down on that and to double down on the partnerships, the ways in which we support leaders in countries like Liberia at critical times. And I want to just salute Senator Coons for going to Liberia during the Ebola crisis. I think one of the only elected officials who did so. But our ability to support and enable that kind of progress is core. And now, with this uptick of violence that we're seeing, we got to get in there and we got to keep doing it to sustain the progress and to make more.
Well, one thing we wouldn't have with U.S. global leadership, a legacy of it would be fewer thanks from constituents of Senator Coons today. So that's one thing we know is a product of it. Caroline, your thoughts on this?
Well, you know, as an American company founded in Brooklyn 160 years ago, I can't quite imagine that we would have been able to expand our business in emerging markets had we not had the power, the force, and the brand of the United States government behind us. That said, I too would like to leave on a positive note. I see a lot of innovation and opportunity and enthusiasm by the youth on the continent of Africa, but in emerging markets overall. And I think that dialogue needs to change in the United States, and we need to really lean into that. We are going to have 300 million people accessing healthcare services for the first time in the next 5 years. As a company, that matters to us. It matters to our social contract with the world, and we need a strong United States government behind us.
So, Rachel, it's worth applauding. That legacy, I think, would be the big thing, that legacy of accomplishment of reducing extreme poverty we talked about in the first panel as well, if the U.S. weren't there. Why don't you close us out with your thoughts on what the world would look like without U.S. leadership?
Yeah, so we've talked about the political change across the continent. That is, I think, the most important area where, you know, we've moved from a continent that was mainly repressive governments to democratically elected governments, and without that, U.S. pushing constantly at the margin on, we wouldn't see that transformation. And interestingly, that has then led to other transformations. So it has helped with the work that the U.S. Leadership has pushed on education. Again, we've seen a complete transformation within sometimes one generation, from virtually no one going to school to virtually everyone going to school. And that is a just incredible change in a very short period. And the U.S. has been critical in pushing and supporting that effort. But it came also because democratically elected governments are more in favor of promoting education. So what's important is these things all work together. So when you get democracy and you get leadership of the US, you see progress on these human development indicators, which really are just, we have not seen the improvements in human development, reductions in poverty, any time in the past than we have seen in the last 20 years.
Great. I want to thank our panelists very much in a moment. Before we do a couple housekeeping matters, we're going to have a break now. We're going to ask everyone to step out and enjoy our expo so we can get the room ready for lunch. So after that's taken care of, I want to everyone join me in really thanking what a great conversation we had up here, really interesting. And thank our panelists for their leadership. Outstanding. And thank you for your questions. We'll see you back here in a half an hour at noon, okay? That's great.
Hello, everyone. Hello, could I have your attention? I'm back to the stage. Nice that you're with us for lunch and what I'll call some shh. Thank you. I'm Mark Schweiker. You'll see me in the program there. I have as I said to Senator Coons, I've got a 20-minute pass here in the state of Delaware as a former Pennsylvania governor. So nice to be in your company. I jest. You can acknowledge your neighbor state. And in fact, if you're clapping, how about a big round of applause for our host and the staff of the USGLC who've done a super job of bringing us here today. I just said to General Walker at our table that we're going to serve some rhetorical dessert, so to speak. You see at your table we've got some fine chocolate cake, and that's the real dessert. Go for it after your meal. The whole idea is we're going to proceed because one thing, I think one signature aspect of this coalition is that we certainly try to engage influential folks like yourself across all 50 states. And Delaware is certainly stepping up today to meet the expectations of that effort at engagement. But we're grateful for your commitment. We're grateful for your attentiveness. And certainly we are grateful for your time. And so mindful of timing and staying with the program and the flow here, as you see in the program, I think we've got a really interesting and timely closing discussion that three folks will, in which they'll participate. Liz Schreier, who is the top executive at the coalition, will moderate that. But I think we can agree, as we gather on this cloudy Monday in Wilmington, there's a whole lot going on around the world and around this country. I think you know there are an awful lot of people who wish to see the U.S. stay engaged and bold and respected. And isn't it interesting, as the President travels now, I think, through his fifth country, that he continues to hear that sentiment. He continues to hear that plea that we need the U.S. on this figurative stage expressing comfort with global leadership. I know it's on your mind. In part, that's what drives you here. It's certainly on my mind as someone going back to 2001, and I handled the deployment when United Flight 93 crashed in Shanksville just a couple of hours north of here. And the historical note there, friends, is that when we don't get it right relative to international relationships and trying to advance diplomacy and proper developmental efforts and the use of smart power around the world, there are folks around here and around this world who will try to perpetrate some very ugly things. And we all saw it on 9/11. You've not forgotten it, and certainly I'm one of a handful of governors who will never forget what was expected of us on that deployment back on 9/11 of 2001. In part, sentimentally explains why I helped with the coalition and why the many folks who are in this room are part of the leadership effort, and you, as important leaders in the faith-based realm or NGOs or business development groups, also are inclined to give us your time, your volunteer effort as well, and we appreciate that. But we cannot let up, especially in this day and age. And the reason I say this, friends, it was interesting to see as I was flying on the weekend in a major magazine, the rhetorical question was raised. Wow, who's really leading the way now? Is it China? Is it the United States? Legitimate questions. And I think we can all agree that they are not only proverbial questions. This is a matter of how we can put ourselves in the world, across this planet, and in a way that it creates economic reward and promise for your neighbors. I often say to folks, geez, it might be that third base coach might be in a job that's export related right outside Wilmington. They may not even know it. So it's our job to try to articulate that connection between what we do in a global sense and economic reward right here at home and right here in Wilmington. And we accomplish that in part in gatherings like this. So we are grateful that you see it that way and would give us some of your valuable time. So on to the rhetorical dessert, so to speak. We've got some great insights for you, some great perspective to share. I'll introduce them, and then Liz Schreier will take it from here. I don't think I've got to offer an expanded introduction on my friend Chris Coons, Senator Coons, who was right here. Known Chris for some time, you can acknowledge his leadership. From my standpoint, we need more like Senator Coons in the Senate, someone who understands how to get it done in a public policy sense. So, Chris, thank you for your interest in being here. Look forward to your comments and insights. Next is the 18th administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, an incredibly important force for good. I know Mark does a super job of articulating what it does in a mission and everyday sense, whether it's fighting poverty or what he does so well, talking about, what democratic values mean for countries and societies that really know very little about that dynamic. So, given his background, and that's why he's an appropriate panelist today. Former member of Congress from Wisconsin. Former ambassador to Tanzania. There may not be any more impressive study of what goes on in the continent of Africa than Mark Green. So we've got accomplished folks who are widely respected, and they're right here in your hometown of Wilmington. So with that, let me ask Liz Schreier to lead our panelists to the stage. Liz, the program is yours. Big hand for our panelists.
Well, thank you to Governor Mark Schweiker. Gentlemen. Governor, thank you. He's been an extraordinary friend. Senator, and I think Senator's over there. Well, gentlemen, this has been a pretty fabulous day. Thank you to our speakers who are still here. You have a high bar because this has been quite a fabulous day. I think this panel is kind of I view this, we have a lot to cover, and it's really to look forward to figure out how to solve all the problems that have just been described over the first half of the day. I want to start by getting a little personal with you, my friend Mark, because I think most of your constituents know why you care so much about these issues. You talked about it at the opening, but not everybody knows Administrator Green. You have devoted a big chunk of your life to fighting global poverty and development, and it really goes back to some of your most earlier part of your career. Introduce yourself. Why? And welcome.
First off, it's
We're
great
so
to be
thrilled to
here.
have
It's
you
great
here.
to be in Senator Coons' state and constituency. And I've got to tell you, I feel blessed to be here. Senator Coons is a huge supporter of the work that we do at USAID, and also, quite frankly, just a great friend. We share a lot of values, and we share a passion for lifting lives and building communities, and there are very few people in Washington, D.C. who are doing more for the cause than Senator Chris Coons. In terms of my background, I think what I always point to, really quite frankly, is my time as ambassador. Now, going back 30 years ago, my wife and I were
we don't do all 30 years.
Yeah, won't do all 30. My wife Sue and I were teachers in Kenya, in Western Kenya, with a program called World Teach, volunteer teachers, and lived and worked in a village where only about half the kids ever went to any kind of school at all, and only a handful would ever graduate from school. But my time as ambassador, I think, drove it home more than anything else. And I remember one day, my father, who's just retired, is a physician, and he and I delivered food to AIDS shut-ins in a place called Morogoro in Tanzania. And I remember going to do that with him, feeling very proud of myself. My dad, the doctor, was actually going to see something close to doing rounds in East Africa. And I remember going to one place that looked more like a farm shed than it did a home, and going inside, and no light, of course, no electricity, and finally waiting till my eyes adjusted to the light and seeing a poor woman, obviously very, very ill with AIDS, sitting on a little bucket in the center of a dirt floor. And we delivered some grain for her family. And I remember her looking at me and saying, "I just have one question for you." I said, "Okay." And she said, "I used to be a businesswoman, and I was successful. My husband contracted AIDS and has died. half her children had died from complications of AIDS. And she said, the question is, with the last little bit of money I have, should I buy books for my children who are healthy or meds for the ones who are not? How do you answer a question like that? No. And I remember as I was walking away, my dad saying to me, Mark, can't the government do something? I said, did. There's no welfare. There's no Medicaid. This is it. If we don't do this, it doesn't happen. You cannot go through an experience like that and not believe that America is a force for good in the world.
Amazing. Well, now you are sitting in a seat where you can do something great on that, and we're going to talk about that. I want to unravel some of the issues that we've been talking about so far, and I want to start with one that Senator Coons, you talk about a lot, and that's national security. I see you, and I mentioned this morning when I kicked off on television often, you've been talking about North Korea, Iran, Syria, but I want to talk about one of the bills that you mentioned on that video, wildlife trafficking. Yeah. And it strikes me that this whole conversation today about how leading globally matters locally, and there's one that when I go around the country, people go, wait a minute, wildlife trafficking, development, humanitarian, national security, help connect the dots, because we all want to be good voices to explain this.
There's a couple different reasons that we should care about the dramatic rash of poaching that is wiping out rhinos and elephants and other iconic species across Africa. First is just because they're gorgeous parts of creation. They're remarkable animals. Second is because of who's killing them and why. And then third is where those funds go. So in countries that Senator Flake and I had a chance to visit together last year, in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, you have organized poacher networks that are going in and killing elephants and rhinos and taking their tusks and horns, and then selling them through transnational criminal networks. Because elephant tusk and rhino horn is worth more in some cases than a pound of gold or a pound of heroin. And the people who traffic in animal parts are also trafficking in drugs, in weapons, and in people. So billions of dollars that's being generated by the slaughter of whole herds of elephants or dozens and dozens of rhinos are fueling organizations that then are also delivering weapons and support, whether it's Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram, whether they're driving instability in a particular country, in a whole region. It's become mechanized and it's become global. So part of why Senator Flake and I worked together on this and joined with co-sponsors in the House and then joined with the administration in it, part of why there's still a necessary role for USAID and the Fish and Wildlife Service is to protect creation, is to protect the opportunity for future generations to see these majestic animals, but more than anything else, is to deny funding to some of the most deadly transnational terrorist networks we know.
I noticed that, Mark, one of your first trip as administrator was to East Africa. You went right into the belly of the beast where it's the most extreme famine, but also not just where there's famine, but where it's man-made conflict. Talk a little bit about why there, and again, the same conversation about where development, humanitarian crisis, and our national security are at risk.
So that first trip was to Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia. Ethiopia was the good news story in a lot of ways. South Sudan and Sudan are the troubled lands. So first off, to set the framework, there are 66 million displaced people in the world today. In 2016, that was 20 people per day who were displaced. And all of the challenges that goes with displacement, unsettling, instability, but hunger. The famines in the world these days, almost all of them are man-made famines. And so they require man-made solutions. So in Sudan and South Sudan, we were visiting some of the refugee camps, internally displaced persons camps, taking a look at the challenges that they face and the challenges that they cause, taking those on. But I mentioned that Ethiopia was the success story, because in Ethiopia, although they're in the third consecutive year of drought, they're not in famine.
Right.
They have their challenges, but they're not in famine. And the reason that they're not, quite frankly, is because the generosity of all of you. The investments that have been made in Feed the Future, which is our Global Food Security Act, or global food security legislation, have kept the families, people, communities of Ethiopia out of complete destitution and out of complete famine. And I saw some of those programs at work. Some of the resilience that we've developed in those challenged areas shows you what can be done with development tools. So that's why that part of the work.
Can I ask one thing? I want to ask both of you about the South Sudan, because I know you were at the refugee camps right outside of South Sudan. But one of the things that Mark, you have made a very big part of your mantra is around corruption. Mm-hmm. You were part of the legislation that created the Millennium Challenge Corporation. You were on the board. You're back on the board again. In South Sudan, you had some pretty tough conversations, as I recall, with the leader of South Sudan, talking about, you want our aid, you have to make sure that you treat it appropriately. Where does fighting corruption fit in? And Senator, I would ask you the same question.
Well, in some ways it ties back to what Chris mentioned earlier. When we take a look at these challenges, they all fit together. So corruption, broad-scale corruption, kleptocracy, if you will, is the way that authoritarian leaders fund their operations, also fund extremist voices, fund instability. So it really does all fit together. So in South Sudan, I had some very harsh words for President Kiir. That it's the most dangerous place in the world for humanitarian workers, which is saying something. And visiting those camps, you could see the dangers that they were facing. But also, B, you have in President Kiir a head of state who clearly has no regard whatsoever about the best interests or suffering of his people. And so I went there to say, look, on behalf of the American government, more importantly, on behalf of the American people, this can't go on. And it won't go on. And that we need to reassess how we do our assistance to make sure that it is going for those in need and not going to fund some of the policies that are causing so much suffering and pain.
Three things about that quickly. First, in the last Congress, we passed and the President signed into law the Foreign Aid Transparency and Accountability Act. And a piece of that is making sure that we're making good on an obligation to help you understand how the tax dollars that fund foreign assistance are being spent. Second, on meeting with Salva Kiir, Chairman Corker and I went to Uganda over Easter weekend. I spent Easter Sunday in Juba in South Sudan and visiting refugee camps both in the capital and then several hours north in one of the most desolate, just absolutely desperate places I've ever seen, where children were deeply malnourished and where there was a lot of violence and dislocation. And being able to say to President Kiir that there was going to be accountability, and then come back and meet with the Secretary of the Treasury and press for sanctions on Salva Kiir and some of the SPLA leaders and some of the folks most responsible for the dramatic human suffering there, is, I think, an important piece of putting tools in place so that if there isn't any improvement, we're ready to take action. And I was very encouraged that Ambassador Nikki Haley, who's the administration's ambassador to the UN, also recently went to South Sudan, met with Salva Kiir, and delivered an even tougher version of the same message we did. And I think it's time for us to step up and act against this uniquely abusive head of state. Let me last on the comment you made, Mark, about resiliency. In Ethiopia, I had a chance to visit 2 years ago, and we went to a site funded by Feed the Future in partnership with DuPont, where we got to meet a whole group of smallholder farmers in the Ethiopian highlands who had tripled their yield. So the amount of maize or corn that they were able to produce on very small plots had nearly tripled in just a few years by moving to a DuPont-provided hybrid. Sorry, that's a shout-out to a local town favorite.
It's okay, you're allowed.
But that's one of the ways that we make real the promise of resiliency. So when famine, when drought comes back to Ethiopia, a new drought-resistant strain that is appropriate for that particular area has been developed after a lot of work and a lot of investment, and that makes possible folks who can live through it rather than starving. So there are things we can do to affect the condition of hundreds of millions of families across the continent. Feed the Future has prevented 500 million families from facing famine this year. we are making a difference with the leadership of Mark Green and other folks at USAID.
If I can just add, so two points to add on to what you've just heard. First off, I think you've already recognized that this whole area that we're talking about is a safe zone politically. So this is an area where Republicans and Democrats check partisan labels at the door, and we work together to try to create solutions, to try to ease human suffering. I look at every administration in modern times as having contributed tools to this very important part of our foreign policy. I served under President Bush, the AIDS Initiative, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which you heard about, President Obama's Power Africa, but in particular Feed the Future. These are tools that keep building on to American leadership and are making a world of difference. I think Feed the Future has been a game changer, quite frankly, in American foreign policy. I'm proud to support it. I'm looking for ways to expand it as much as I can. But secondly, what you also heard about is that we're trying to tap into the private sector to help us to create solutions. It's in the interests of those we're trying to serve, but it's also in our interests. The genius of our private sector, particularly working in the food security area, but also in the global health area, the only way that we're going to be successful is if we can tap into and unleash the genius, the entrepreneurial spirit of those sectors, of DuPont and others. So that's something that we're devoted to doing more and more.
So let me ask you both about this. There's a large contingent here from the business sector. They were our partners in helping put this together. Senator Coons, you created the Economic Growth and Development Act and taking a look at how to make it easier for the business community and the U.S. government to work together. So talk a little bit about what are some of the barriers that you saw that inspired you to say, hey, we need some legislation to make it actually more effective for the business community and the United States government to work together on this. And then, Mark, I want to ask you a follow-up question on that as well.
Well, there's two sides to this equation. One is that Africa has access to U.S. markets through something called AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, almost literally one of Bill Clinton's last bills he signed into law. Republican Senator Johnny Isakson and I worked hard together to make sure that through AGOA, there are both export opportunities for U.S. poultry into a number of countries in Africa.
You always get that one in, too.
I always get that in. And that there are opportunities for African countries to export to the United States. So far, South Africa has taken more advantage of the AGOA opportunity than, frankly, the whole rest of the continent combined. Mm-hmm. And on a bipartisan basis, we're committed to trying to do more capacity building so that there's more export opportunities that are going to help the private sector invest in Africa and Africans lift themselves out of poverty. But we also need to do more to ready small businesses in the United States for the growing export opportunities of growing African markets. I'm on the Small Business Committee. My Appropriations Subcommittee funds the SBA. And there's a lot more we can and should do with the African diaspora community in the United States, with small businesses that have the opportunity to export. In an increasingly interconnected, globalized world, there are real opportunities for the United States to take advantage of several of our competitive opportunities here. A diaspora community, robust capital markets, now stronger and stronger linkages, both digital and data, and in terms of export opportunities. And those are things I'm looking forward to working on in partnership with Republican friends in Congress in this next year.
So that's fabulous. Mark, one of the things that you've said is you want to transform and even take it to the next level, public-private partnerships. There are, I think I have the number right, but about 1,600, give or, maybe there's a little less, a little more, public-private partnerships at USAID. And Pfizer talked about them already on the program earlier today. Coca-Cola was here, a representative, talking about them today. And a lot of times when I travel, I hear, why can't the private sector just do it alone? What is it that government can do? And you have often talked about government can leverage so that private sector can bring it to scale and impact. Talk about what your vision is of what you can do at USAID for private sector to bring to scale and impact.
Well,
because here's a senator who wants all of his businesses to take advantage of it.
And they are, and that's good. No, we want to expand it even more broadly. So part of what I want to do is lower the costs of participating. So I want to create more opportunities, particularly for small businesses, and I agree, that's really where the opening is, where the juice is, and make it easier for small business, small NGOs, small academic institutions to participate in program design, in program implementation. So what we want to do is move beyond traditional contracting and grant making. We'll still do both of those, but move towards collaboration. So bringing in the private sector earlier in the process to help us in program design, to help us in co-financing, and in risk sharing to make it easier for small businesses to participate in the process. You really need the new ideas that the private sector and small businesses in particular represent if we're going to meet our ambitious goals.
Can I ask you on this financing? You mentioned earlier this morning about your interest. You have a piece of legislation that you're getting off the ground about development financing.
Yes.
One of the things that has come up a lot today is the word China. They are out there in Africa alone over the last decade, 780% increase in their development assistance. We can't even track all the amount of money in the world they're putting in. Where does development finance come in from your point of view? Why are you focused on this?
Well, the United States has a badly outdated development finance system that is split up between several different entities and agencies. USAID has a piece of it, OPIC has a piece of it, USTDA, the Trade Development Administration, has a piece of it, Commerce has a little piece of it. It's scattered, it's not particularly focused, and it is dramatically outsized by our competitors in this space, both European and Asian.
Yeah.
So I'd first like to modernize the authorities that are available to the administration as a tool for development finance. I'd like to make sure that our development finance efforts are tightly aligned with what USAID is doing so that we don't have development out here and financing over here. Yeah. And it's something that has to be available to companies of all scale in the United States. Development finance, export in particular, XM and OPIC financing have been very helpful to a number of large American manufacturing companies, but haven't been as broadly accessible to small companies. As I look at Africa and China's role, I'm very concerned that there was a more than decade-long effort. Remember, Bono and the One campaign got started really as a debt relief effort for the millennium. Right. So there were many countries on the continent and across the developing world that had loaded up with debt that wasn't appropriately managed or serviced, that began to crowd out investment in public health and in education. And there was a lot of debt forgiven in the early parts of this century. Now countries are re-emerging. They are taking on new debt, significant amounts of debt, that is from China and with different terms and for different purposes. In the 27 African countries I visited, I'm struck that everywhere the Chinese are present. They're investing, they're engaging. As was referenced in an earlier panel, I remember being in Benin, I think it was, where there was a hospital fully funded by the People's Republic of China, Chinese letters on the front, and inside, doctors, nurses, and medication, all funded by the United States. And the folks we met who were going in and out of that hospital had no idea the United States was providing the vast majority of the assistance for public health in that country. We need to align our partnerships with countries on the continent more closely with their development goals, which I think we've done a good job of. But we also need to realize that in terms of leadership on the continent, our skills and our strength, our private sector and our public investment really can lead us to being the central partner for development for Africa for this century, but only if we step up our game. And I think development finance is going to be a key piece of that.
Well, I was going to say, and this is one of those areas where I think the stars are lining up. Yeah. Senator Kuhn's legislation, I think, is a great idea. President Trump, actually just in Vietnam in hours, if you figure out the time zones.
36 hours ago.
It has talked about the importance of reforming development finance, so I think the time is right. And the way that you've just heard it described, I think, is completely on point, is extraordinarily important. But it is about debt. It's also about lines on extractives. What happens is China comes in, offers a lot of money up front, no conditions up front, but the back-end conditions, the fine print, are dangerous, and I think are going to lead to tremendous frustration actually leading to servitude, because you're going to see future generations in these countries look and see that they've lost the value of the natural resources that are their birthright. So it's very, very important. I know it's not something that necessarily gets lots of attention, but if we can take this on, I think it'll have a tremendous and important difference around the world.
Yeah, it definitely feels like the stars are aligning, and you have led it. There's a similar piece of legislation in the House by a Republican congressman, and it was nice to hear President Trump make a comment. I want to pick up on an issue that has been a passion of both of yours, and that's something you again referenced this morning, and that's the REACH Act. Yes. And it's an issue that is around global health, around maternal and child health. Talk about why it's so important. It's come up on both of the panels already this morning, but why investing in fighting for women and girls' health is such a priority, and whether we can get it over the finish line this year or maybe next year.
Great question.
Certainly this Congress. And whether USAID is ready to partner, and I'm sure the answer is going to be yes, but how?
There's 8 bipartisan co-sponsors. Senator Susan Collins of Maine is my lead co-sponsor on the REACH Act. And it's something we've worked on now several Congresses in a row. And there's a couple of reasons why this is important to do. And the first and foremost is just caring for our fellow human beings. There's 16,000 children a day who die of completely preventable reasons, where for very small investments in remote villages around the continent of Africa and around the developing world, we could be saving lives with demonstrated technologies that cost pennies per delivery and can dramatically change the outcome of difficult deliveries. First. Second, in development, investing in women and girls is the smartest investment you can make. In country after country and study after study, a marginal dollar invested in sending girls to school and in giving women economic power has dramatic consequences. It's embarrassing to admit as a male, but across the continent, if you give a man and a woman exactly the same acreage and inputs, the woman will produce at least 10% more. And where women have more money, they send their kids to school, they invest in their community.
Some of us here aren't that surprised.
You're not surprised, I know. And, so the reality is, if we're going to invest a little extra money in promoting peace and stability, in promoting the human condition and in addressing poverty, making sure that women give birth to healthy children is the single smartest investment we can make.
Well,
and then last, it's how people see America. I want us to be known as the country that helps affect the most vulnerable moment a family has, which is the moment of birth, and invest in wise ways to make healthy births possible.
Thank you for your leadership on that. Mark, I know USAID has made this a priority for a long time. Is there anything new that you're looking forward to adding to the issue on global health?
Well, let me sort of broaden some of the reasons why it's such a good idea. First off, it's invest a little bit up front or invest a lot later on. In terms of fostering self-reliance in families, in communities, in countries, that's a goal that we should all have. We want countries to shape their own future. Hard for them to do that when they have so many people who are suffering, when they see so many children not being able to realize their potential because of lack of access to basic nutrition, lack of access to health care, lack of access to education. So, it is cost effective in that sense, but also from a national security perspective. If you leave communities to be taken over by despair and hopelessness, you make them vulnerable to the worst kinds of influences in the world. Criminal influences, violent extremist influences. And so if we're really going to make this world a safer place, if we're really going to take on as a generational challenge violent extremism, we have to make these investments.
Great. Let's take questions from the audience. So line up, and again, I'll reiterate what my other fellow moderator said. Please, no speeches. While you're getting up there, he laughs. You know your constituents. I'm going to ask one while people are walking up. We're a coalition that advocates around making sure there's effective resources. And you mentioned this morning there was a proposal to cut about a third of the budget. Where do you see that going forward? The Congress has been very, very clear from the Freedom Caucus to the Progressive Caucus, nope, we are not for that. Yeah. We're about 12 days, 10 days left in the legislative cycle. Are they going to push back and make sure there's the resources for all these programs that we're talking about, Senator?
Well, the end of the year is going to be a cliffhanger yet again. And we're just a few days on the legislative calendar from the December 8th expiration of our current continuing resolution. So in the absence of some broader agreement, the federal government shuts down December 8th. I don't expect that to happen, but in the 7 years that I've been in the Senate and in the years I've been serving on both budget and appropriations, I haven't seen a cycle this broken, which is saying something. The State and Foreign Ops Subcommittee on which I serve that sets this coming year's budget for USAID and the State Department, we've had a markup on a bipartisan basis. Senator Graham of South Carolina, Senator Leahy of Vermont, and other committee members agreed on a acceptable level of funding for state and USAID. But I am hopeful that we will increase it because we've got, as you've heard, famines in a number of countries. We've got a record amount of refugees. Currently, we are facing literally the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War, and the world is looking to the United States for engagement and leadership, and we've got underfunded pledges in most of these countries. So we won't know until probably, I'm predicting we'll be there Christmas Eve. Okay. But there is strong bipartisan support for
thanks largely
fully funding
to your
state
leadership.
And USAID.
All right, we'll come back. I have a question on that for Mark, but why don't we take these two? And again, as brief as possible since there's a long line. Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Senator Coons, for this great meeting that you have organized.
You have to talk a little louder.
I'm thankful to Senator Coons for this meeting, and I'm so glad that you spoke about AGOA. It is so disheartening that 17 years since AGOA was initiated as an act of parliament here, only South Africa is a beneficiary. I'm from Kenya, and my wife and I are here trying to see how we can together work under the African Growth Opportunity Act to not only make inroads for the US, but to help our African countries to come. How can we get that assistance through the US Global Leadership Coalition?
Great question. Tutafanya kazi pamoja.
Senator Flakes, it's good to see you. I hope you're a fan of the Wildcats. I'm an alumni of University of Arizona. Advertisement. South Sudan, a possibility of becoming a failed state in the East Africa, which become very serious because it's close to Al-Qaeda. What are the three surrounding countries' presidents? Are they helpful? Are they good to actually stabilize the Southern Sudan? President Some of Ethiopia, al-Bashir of Sudan, and Museveni of Uganda. What contributions are they making for stabilizations of South Sudan?
Good questions. Which of the
Such
two of
great
you would
questions,
like to
I'd be
begin?
happy to let Mark answer. No,
I think those are flying your way.
And let me briefly, to South Sudan, IGAD, the regional group has made good noises, hosted a number of meetings, but frankly has been disappointing in terms of their engagement. And part of the message that I delivered, I think Mark delivered, I think Ambassador Haley delivered, was to our regional partners that we need their engagement as well. To give credit where credit's due, Uganda has been tremendously welcoming of refugees from South Sudan,
they sure have.
Has given refugees freedom to travel, has given them access to land, has welcomed them in a way that few countries in the world do to such a dramatic refugee flow. Ethiopia has also been welcoming and supportive of refugees, but our goal is not to have the region welcome refugees. Our goal is to stabilize South Sudan and end the violence. We need pressure from Sudan, from Ethiopia, from Uganda, but we also need leadership by the elected president, the folks who led to an independent South Sudan after decades of conflict should not now be presiding over the collapse of the nation that is the most newly independent in the world. As for Kenya and AGOA, I do think there are real opportunities, particularly in fabrics and garments, in Ethiopia, in Uganda, and in Kenya. And I'd be happy to have an opportunity to talk further with the gentleman. There's people from my office here. One of our challenges is connecting the diaspora community in the United States with opportunities on the continent. When Secretary Clinton was secretary, I pressed for specific conferences around diaspora opportunities. It's something I think we should be looking at, both in terms of financing, in terms of things that Commerce and AID and State do, and as a way to help communicate the value of capitalism and a truly free and democratic society to countries where many here and many across our country have family connections.
Be terrific.
On AGOA, I agree with everything that Chris has just said. I think we're looking for ways to, again, lower the barriers for participation. Quite frankly, I don't think the U.S. does as well at reaching out to its diaspora community as some of our donor partners do, and we need to do a better job of that. First off, there are obvious the connections in family ties that I think participation is much more likely in those communities. Secondly, it's also harnessing the strength. I'm the son of immigrants, and what we see is new Americans oftentimes have the zeal of converts in terms of ideas and energy towards partnerships around the world. I think we need to do a better job of that than we are. Secondly, with respect to South Sudan, right around now is when the high-level revitalization forum is taking place with the group that Chris mentioned, and I think we all want to see it succeed. It's a good idea. I think everyone's patience is running thin, though, and this simply cannot continue to go on. Chris was clear, I was clear, Ambassador Haley. The U.S. is running out of patience, as the world is. This is not only a failing state, it is a humanitarian outrage and catastrophe, and we have no choice as Americans, I think, than to care and find some ways to change the trajectory.
Frightening. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Matanda Mandela, and I have a brief question. According to research done in 2014 by the group Achieve, over 84% of millennials have done charitable donations, including at least an hour of community service. And however, some of us have come across the struggle of not being able to do or are incapable of doing things like Greenpeace, the Peace Corps, or even Fulbright or Rhodes programs. So my question is, how do we find ways to help out on the ground? And if people are capable of going more in person, how do we reciprocate the aid, and more importantly, on equal footing and mutual respect with the nations that we are trying to help? Thank you very much.
Terrific question. Great. Please.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Carmita Albaras. I'm a forensic social worker and president of an organization called Family Unification and Resettlement Initiative. And it's an organization that was formed to address the vexing issue of deportation to countries that really cannot afford what is happening. Countries in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. And I would like to know, what is the leadership, the U.S. global leadership, particularly USAID, how can you work with grassroots organizations who are trying to address this issue? Because there is such destabilization in these nations because of individuals who are deported. And the thing is that there is this false belief that all individuals who are deported are criminals. This is not the case. And what happens a lot of times is that you've got people going down with skills that can be harnessed into nation building, but because of the roadblocks that are instituted, they cannot do so. So I would really like to know how that can be addressed. Thank you very much.
Do you want to tackle the second one and you get the first one?
Sure. With respect to the drivers of displacement of families, there are a number of them, and it depends on the part of the world. But in all cases that I'm aware of, they're fleeing something. In Central America in particular, we're working hard to take on some of the drivers that cause unaccompanied minors, for example, to go 1,000 miles through some of the most horrendous conditions on earth. So we're taking on citizen security. We're helping local leaders take on organized crime, drug trafficking, some of the challenges that they see that destroy communities and again, are driving irregular migration. In the Horn of Africa, it is conflict that is driving so much of this. Look, all of this matters to everyone involved. It's extraordinarily important that we take these challenges on because the movements of people, again, 66 million displaced right now, are destabilizing both the countries from which people come and the countries potentially to which they go. And so I think for national security as well as humanitarian reasons, we have to take on conditions in both areas. In countries that are receiving asylum seekers, refugees, irregular migrants, we're trying to help take on some of the service needs that are there on a humanitarian level. And in the driver countries where the conflicts are, taking on the drivers, the conflicts themselves, as well as crime. But this is challenging the very model through which all of our assistance flows. So traditionally, it's sort of bilateral. You go country by country. Well, right now, as Chris alluded to, if you're trying to provide help to South Sudanese, you got to go to Uganda because there are 1.4 million South Sudanese in Uganda. And so you can see what this is doing. It's destroying the very model that we're all used to. So it is among the most urgent challenges facing America today, as well as the world. And it's something that we have to take on because if we fail to, we're at risk of losing an entire generation to potential exploitation.
And the question about service and millennials, the millennial generation is showing a real passion for engaging in service and a real global sensibility. Conveniently, I just introduced a bill called the Action for National Service. Some of you are familiar with AmeriCorps, with Peace Corps, and with other non-military national service opportunities. We've got a real crisis in the United States in terms of the affordability of higher education and our cohesion as a country. Our ability to hear each other and respect each other across differences that are regional or partisan or ethnic or differences of religion or experience. And in my view, one of the things we can and should do is provide more opportunities for young Americans who want to serve to do so in the military and in the civilian world, overseas and at home. We've got a lot of needs here at home that could be very well addressed by young volunteer Americans who can then earn a college opportunity as a result of their service to our country. This is an idea I think deserves bipartisan support. I've been working with other senators to try and strengthen it. Our enduring monument to former Senator, late Senator Ted Kennedy, is the Edward M. Kennedy National Service Act. We've never fully funded the number of service opportunities that young people apply for. On the most competitive college campuses in America, when there's a recruitment night for AmeriCorps or for the Peace Corps, you'll have 5 or 10 people show up for every available slot. I think we should be investing in giving the next generation of young patriots who want to serve our country at home and abroad the opportunity to do so.
Hear, hear. Wouldn't that be terrific? Terrific. Yes, please.
John Bell, Better Business Bureau. So there's a lot of fraud and scam that originates overseas, not specifically in Africa, but certainly there amongst other places. When you ask local businesses to look at engaging in a global trade like that, what specific resources are available to help those local businesses establish the credibility of the companies that they might partner with to make sure that they are working with legitimate companies? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And please.
Yeah, thank you, the panel. My name is Bamgu Diallo. I'm a general contractor. I would like to share an experience I had when I went to Africa last month. So the question is going to be, we as a diaspora here and who's a business owner, and we try to go back home and try to help or be part of the business environment there because there's too much competition there. So what we did, we tried to import U.S. product made in renewable energy here. And then when we got there, it was so hard to get through the government system because providing the energy supply there is a big contract there. So we had a hard time now. We're trying to go through the U.S. Embassy and the U.S. aid. I went there personally. But unfortunately, they could not help us because we went to the Mali and they don't have Power Africa program is not there. It's only in Ghana and Ethiopia. So my question is, how we as a business owner here, we can address the situation to you guys here that help us, because we plan to organize a international conference on renewable energy in Africa.
That one may be very specific. That may be too specific for the public arena. If it is, maybe one of you can talk. But if you,
and Chris is a huge champion and leader on Power Africa, so I'll defer to him. But one of the things that you're pointing to, so we also incentivize policy reforms in the countries in which we work to make it easier for businesses and outsiders to be able to participate. Secondly, there was some question earlier about the role that USAID can play in private sector engagement. One of them is convening. So we can help to craft opportunities and by bringing partners together, create relationships and opportunities that help you to be able to participate. So, you're not going to know businesses in many of these countries. We can help pull them together through the framework of Feed the Future and food security, Power Africa in energy production distribution, and that's one way that should make it easier.
Do you want to talk about?
The other question was about rule of law and how do you know that you're dealing with a legitimate counterparty or contractor if you're selling goods or services or entering into a contract. And I think the questions are also connected in some ways. How do American folks here who want to participate in exporting renewable energy technology do so successfully, and how do businesses more broadly partner in Africa? First, the risk of fraud, the risk of entering into a contract with another company that doesn't meet their commitments is a risk everywhere you do business in the world. But this is part of what U.S. law enforcement and the U.S. Department of Commerce provide through our embassies around the world. In a number of countries in the developing world, I've met with the United States Chamber of Commerce, the AmCham in that country, and we've got folks from U.S. law enforcement embedded in embassies around the world, and more importantly, we've also got the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service in many embassies around the world that can help with market studies before you begin to explore the opportunity, that can help with access to risk insurance through OPIC and financing through EXIM before you begin to enter into an agreement. And then last, understanding the context of the country where you're doing business. What's the rule of law really like? If there is some issue of fraud or some failure to deliver on a commitment, are you going to have the opportunity to go to court and to seek reimbursement or not? Because not every country has robust and transparent legal systems. Part of what I think is a piece of our development financing infrastructure going forward is to help companies in the United States better understand and better account for the risk involved in going after particular opportunities. I'll just reference one example that has been present at this conference in the past. There's a small metal bridge company in central Pennsylvania, a Crow Bridge, that got their start building bridges across rivers in Western Europe during the Second World War, where U.S. troops would come upon a river. The Germans would have blown up the bridges. They had a very small modular pontoon bridge system.
Really?
Yeah. And guess what? Today they are exporting. They've gotten contracts in countries throughout Central Africa, Cameroon, for example, and they have been galvanizing their bridges here in Delaware and exporting them out of ports, whether Wilmington, Philadelphia, or New Jersey. Without the assistance of the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service and the Export-Import Bank and OPIC, they likely wouldn't have taken on the risks of selling, but they've now made millions of dollars and employed people in Pennsylvania and in Delaware in what is a small family business that keeps selling small modular bridges for places in the developing world where there aren't bridges that can survive the rainy season. They've made a difference in small towns in rural Ghana and Cameroon in a way that I think shows what the U.S. government in partnership with the private sector can do.
That's a great story.
Can I just add a point on that? So earlier Chris talked about development finance legislation. Being able to pull together the different agencies, that would make it easier, less confusing, so there's essentially one place to go. Secondly, if you wonder about any country, the World Bank has doing business indicators. You can go to its website and it will show you what some of the barriers are in each of these countries for startups. Then finally, where I hope that USAID will get to in the next several months is in most of the sectors where we're working, in many of the countries where we're working, we'll do what are known as broad agency announcements. And what that will do is say, look, we've got this money available to this country for this kind of a challenge. Are you interested? It'll only require 2 pages to express a statement of interest, and that should get the conversation going to help lower those barriers.
Fantastic. Let's do this. Let's take the last 3 comments real brief, and we'll let the 2 of them wrap up. Please.
Thank you. My name is David Kagbo. I'm an adjunct professor at Temple University, but I also run an NGO that I do every summer in Sierra Leone, helping people out there. My question is, as I look across the continent, and probably in some other developing countries, one of the impediments really to development is education. A lot of the people, most people in the country, once they're not educated, they don't hold their governments accountable. And the people that get into power know they can do anything they want. At the end, they'll go back, maybe buy them a bag of rice, some money, and they get elected. And sometimes not even fairly elected. So I think for development in these developing countries, education should be forefront. And what is, if any, the United States is probably doing to address that issue?
Great. Thank you. And the last 2.
My name is Felista Ngui from Kenya, and I work with Smart Investment, Women and Girls. I've founded an organization called Fortress Hope Africa. And my question today is not about the smart investment, but it's related to leadership in Africa. I'm from Kenya, so we understand what's been going on in Kenya. We have an election that was nullified by the Supreme Court. And there have been criticism of the developing country, especially US, of promoting peaceism, whereby you just want peace, so it means there's no active war, but there's a lot of injustices. So the people are crying and there's no justice. And so my question and probably my cry is for US to really think about their policy to ensure that they are investing in Africa or in Kenya in policies that promote social and economic justice and ensure that people feel represented, and you're supporting leaders who are for the people and who represent the people, instead of promoting a bunch of, dictators that are really emerging in Africa.
Great, thank you.
What's going on? I'm Zach. I'm from Westchester, and first let me thank Professors Creedy and Stevenson for having us here. I really appreciate it. Could you elaborate on what exactly we're doing to stop animal trafficking? Is it just better arming park rangers, or are we just pouring money into those areas? And does it extend outside of Africa to places like Asia and South America?
Okay. All right.
I'll try and do those briefly in order and then hand it to Mark. So we are contributing a relatively modest amount of money compared to the scale of the problem of wildlife trafficking. What I think is one of our most effective interventions is in training. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the law enforcement agency responsible for fish and wildlife in every state in the United States are now doing joint training with leaders who are engaged in wildlife protection, the Park Service or park rangers from all across the continent. I've met with them several times. Just a few weeks ago at National Geographic headquarters, there was a gathering of some of the leaders in wildlife protection on the continent and through the Fish and Wildlife Service. So they're helping at the most fundamental level with law enforcement tools, forensics. What's the best equipment? How do you cover a massive amount of territory with a very small number of people? Should you arm your patrols or not? How do you train them? How do you clear snares? How do you engage the human community? That's at the most sort of law enforcement basic level. At a higher level, USAID, and I'll encourage Mark to talk about it, is recognizing that while we may view from the distance of the United States an elephant or a rhinoceros as this majestic creature, for a smallholder farmer, the elephant's tearing up their crops and is terrorizing their kids and is annoying their animals. So go talk to a rancher in Montana about the reintroduction of the gray wolf. They feel about the same. So if you don't get human development moving in the right direction, if food security and if opportunity for women and girls and human health aren't moving in the right direction, you're going to have humans poaching animals because they view them as a nuisance, a threat, and an opportunity to make money. And frankly, when you've got people living on the edge, you can't blame them. Because if an elephant that's walking through their farm fields is worth tens of thousands of dollars to a poacher and a trafficker and is only harming them and their family, you're asking an awful lot to ask them to simply let the elephant keep majestically trampling the crops that they'll use to feed their children. So engaging human development, which is a lot of what USAID does, in partnership with wildlife conservation is something we are investing in at the park level, at the national level, and regionally, first. Second, as to the election in Kenya, I just met with Raila Odinga this past week. I am urging that the government of Kenya not interfere with the Supreme Court and that the rule of law be respected. It is important that emerging democracies like Kenya have full participation from civil society, that there be a respect for the rule of law, and that there be an independence to the electoral process. I believe our ambassador has been very engaged, and USAID and other entities of the U.S. government have been engaged over several election cycles in investing not just in opposing violence, but in promoting civil society and promoting the machinery of elections and ultimately of democracy. This is difficult work. It is taking a generation. Many were encouraged that the Supreme Court felt empowered to challenge the election, but then discouraged about Odinga's party's choice not to participate in the next election, thus leading to a very one-sided result. The Liberian Supreme Court has also taken an unprecedented step. I view the independence of court systems across the continent from an encouraging lens. I think it is a good thing that you've got courts that are willing to review elections. But we've got a long journey ahead in terms of providing stable and predictable elections on the continent.
Comment and also on education.
Sure. On the education front, two things I'd point out. Number one, recognize that it's how we spend the education dollars that really matter. Two examples. President Kikwete in Tanzania, when I served as ambassador, announced they were building 3,000 primary schools. It's great. Had no teachers, but they had schools. And so investing in quality teachers, making sure that they have the education and training and background and tools they need is, I think, key. Secondly, I keep coming back to the displaced communities challenge. Think about this. How do you provide education to a generation that was either born or raised in a refugee camp, coming and going all the time? If we don't take this on, I think we are going to pay the price years from now. Secondly, on education, first off, Kenyan education is close to both of us from our backgrounds. I was a teacher in Kenya. In terms of democracy, citizen responsiveness and governance is vitally important. I don't believe that our other investments are sustainable. I don't believe that we'll get the value of those investments in terms of rising generation if we don't invest there in democracy, so that whatever we do is driven by the needs of people. In terms of the wildlife side, conservation side, something that I always remember, Jane Goodall, one of Tanzania's best known, what she did to ensure the survival of the Gombe Stream Park is invest outside of the park. And her argument was that it was improving the livelihoods of the families living just outside the park that would guarantee the survival of the park itself. If you take a look at Gorongosa Park in Mozambique, and Greg Carr, philanthropist, the investments that he's making, a lot of it is in governance, a lot of it is in economic development, and a lot of it is changing the attitudes of the families and the communities around the park so that they don't view that elephant crossing the path as either an enemy or a source of food, but as an investment that will improve their own fortunes. I think that's vitally important. And then finally, in terms of what USAID is doing specifically, it's several things when it comes to the global problem of trafficking. It's making sure that we change attitudes around the world. Secondly, it's also investing in the countries that are the drivers. So it's having programs in China and Southeast Asia which have often been the largest purchasers of wildlife trafficking trophies, and then it's equipping and financing enforcement. Park rangers making sure that they have the tools that they need and the training that they need on the ground to tackle the problem.
So let me close with this. I want you two are, besides the most passionate and skilled and knowledgeable, you're both also
we should just stop right there.
I'm not. I'm going to give you one more. You're both also happen to be two of the most optimistic people that I know. And when we kicked off this half a day of exploration, I want to come back a year from now and say, you know what, that day meant something. That we actually kicked off a conversation where something happened to make it better. So think ahead a year from now. Share one story, one vision, one hope, something from you of what do we hope will have happened a year from now that will say that day when we met in Delaware meant something. Mark.
I'll give you a story from my recent trip to Ethiopia that I think brings a lot of this together. We participated in the food distribution. Again, the part of Ethiopia that we were in, the Somali region, tremendous challenges with drought. As we were distributing grain, a woman who was sitting next to the sack of grain her family had just gotten stopped me. And she said, I have a question for you. And the question that she asked was, this is great. Can you help us with irrigation so we never have to do this again? And I thought, that's it. She's got it. If we can build our programs around that attitude, which I think is inherent in every human being, to want to lead themselves, take care of their family, and if we can all talk about ways that we can lift that attitude up and put it in our programming and put it in what we do, then I think we change everything.
Fabulous. Fabulous. Senator?
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for spending your morning with us. My hope is that by a year from now, you will have had an additional positive experience from someone you met here today, from an organization you connected with that was displaying here, from something you heard out of the conversation, that you've been more inspired and encouraged, and that you'll be more engaged, that you'll speak up about the value, whether it's Senator Carper or Congresswoman Blunt Rochester or me, whether it's our former vice president or our governor, that you'll speak up to folks in elected office and say, I value our place in the world. I value the investments we're making in improving the human condition and in delivering the stability that can lead to progress for democracy and for human rights around the world. It's my hope that you'll give us feedback about what today was like and whether you will recommend participating in this conference if we do it again next year. How could it be different so that the opportunities you hoped for here are real by a year from now? And then last, we were talking over lunch about legislation I really want to get done. I hope a year from now I can come back and report to you that a bipartisan group of us, from the Trump administration to the Senate to the House, have been able to move legislation that helps make real some of the aspirations that have been inspired by our conversations today. That's what I hope for a year from today.
How about join me in thanking these two extraordinary men?
Well done. Well done.
Thank you all for a wonderful day. We'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.